And on behalf of Jim Polly, myself, Visha, Office of Generic Drugs, and everybody who supports the Center for Research in Complex Generics, we really would like to welcome you to this workshop on drug-device combination products, updates, and challenges with demonstrating generic suitability. This is the second workshop of this drug-device combination that we are conducting. And I must say that only a year ago, we started to have in-person workshops. So we are very grateful for everybody who come in person. It should be a fun couple of days. We are also grateful for everybody who sign up online. These workshops are very important for industry. We usually have over 1,000 attendees online, which is kind of remarkable. We're very happy and thankful for organizing committee. The workshop was coordinated on the FDA side by Katharine, Feibus, and Nathan Reed, and Markham was involved. There was a big committee between FDA industry and other stakeholders. We are very grateful for industry representation. We had Brendan Wood from Teva, Clara McDermott from Beatrice, and Satya Patil from Sun Pharma. And we are also very happy for everybody who came here to speak, especially from places far away, from India and Europe. We really need your impact. I'm a professor at University of Michigan. Okay, go Blue, we are champions, right? Football champions. I've never knew about drug-device combination and importance of it until my son got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And as a mother, I'm quite aware now of all the devices that are required. There are pen injectors, and there is now pumps, and there are also glucagon, first powder for injection, and now it's an inhalable device. And it's very important as a patient uses it, the usability and human factors, and can you substitute it, and affordability of the medication, all very important. And it's not something we think about every day. So with that, oops, okay, I clicked the wrong way. Okay, here we are. A little bit about the center. Our center started in 2020. It was established by a grant from Food and Drug Administration Office of Generic Products. It's based between University of Maryland and University of Michigan. Jim Polly runs the Maryland side, and I run Michigan side, and everybody know Visha. Jim and I both work for Visha. That's my biggest, it's a truth, actually. Our mission is to increase access and to safe and effective generic drugs through enhancing infrastructure of communication, education, and collaborative research between academia, FDA, and generic industry. It is very unusual for our workshops. We always have representation of everybody. We have FDA on the same table with the industry, and we have CRCG members and other stakeholders and thought leaders within academia and other organizations. This is a place where we could have our discussion and discuss the actual issues the industry has, the way FDA sees the problem. It's very important. Communication is the most important part to have a progress. And at the end of it, we could promote the main FDA mission to promote and protect public health and generate more knowledge around those complex products and have an open dialogue. Okay. This is our three main goals of CRCG. First of all is infrastructure and communication to understand where the problem lies. Education and training, workshop like this one. This is very important, and we have several workshops that are in person and virtual. We also have some small collaborative research projects that we are conducting to enable some pilot projects that will serve to help us to organize workshop and then get to a bigger research project. In our education mission, we reach out and we have established a relationship with many, many companies that are shown here on the slides and many others. So if some of you we have not spoken to, please reach out to us. We are very happy to talk. This is very important. Through those meetings over Zoom or in person, we understand where the real problems are. And it's very important to get this information from the ground. Now, drug-device combination possesses an important set of challenges. It is both, there is a drug part, there is a device part, but there is also pretty substantial part that is business and legal. And understanding how it's all impacting access to generic medication is very, very important. Through our interviews, we understand several major issues that industry experiencing. So first of all, they really need the clarification when the product is considered to be identical to RLD versus when the human factors testing would be helpful in overcoming any small differences that might not impact the safety or usability of the products. If it's defined that you need the human factor studies, it's very big undertaking. It's expensive. The generic version is never identical to RLD due to intellectual property restrictions. And therefore, how to design it, how many patients you need or users you need, how do you define the comparability, non-inferiority margin? And it's especially difficult for products that have a variable RLDs. I think many questions are around the actual design, and perhaps different products, different design criteria. The auto injectors is one, and injection, but there are inhalers and many others. So this is endless conversation, and really industry wants some good examples of well-conducted studies and statistics affiliated with it. There is always a small differences, and how the small differences impact the usage of the patient and approval is how FDA might be wary of adopting or accepting certain scientific methods that are considered to be routine by the industry. And there is really the main point, perhaps there is really a need for regulatory science and research with regard to acceptable non-inferiority margins in human factor studies. And we need workshops and training and research around it. And I think this is a major question that come over and over again. Drug-device combination is unique, and I really didn't understand it until we started interviewing people. It is truly a business issue, it's a legal issue, it's a patent issue. There is always, even generic company try to design the device. There is so much IP blockage around it. It could never be completely the same. There are also continuation in part. There are constant legal battles around the design and what is possible, what's impossible. When previous model is copied, it's not the same as the current state-of-the-art model. And then apart from the actual patents, there are also trade dress that could prevent adoption of the generic versions. For inhalation products, the shape and of the device, sometimes the color of the device, and other issues. So addressing all of those are critically important, and here, because of that, we have those workshops. Now, education is our big mission. From the start, we had 12 different educational workshops completed. We have 24,000 people who registered and attended those conferences. There are some incoming events in person. You see on May 2-3, we have a model master file. October 7 and 8, we have a very important workshop on immunogenicity risk assessment for generic peptides and oligonucleotides. We have nitrosamine update workshop on November 7, and important to this audience, December 4 and 5, transition to low global warming potential propellants, green propellants, very important for anybody working on inhalers. We currently have 2 calls for data under current grant. This is for modeling for long-acting injectable products. You could look at our website. We have those 2 call for data. If you're working on long-acting injectables and you want to contribute some data to it, please go ahead and answer. They're due on March 29 and May 20th. Here is CRCG. It's Jim, myself, Visha, Jen, and Dana. Kisha also helping us with the running of the workshops. So if you need anything, you could always reach out to us. And this is how to get to it. So we have a website. It's new and updated, very easy to search. We are on social media, both on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then we have a YouTube channel where we post recordings of all the previous workshops. With that, thank you all for participation. And I have 2 more slides. Markham will give opening remarks. And then after Markham will give his remarks, we will have a kind of follow-up discussion from the first workshops, and what we've learned, the summary of it will be given by Katharine and Brandon, and we are looking forward for 2 good days. So thank you so much for all of you who came in person and all of you online as well.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Shady Grove. Anna, thank you so much for that introduction to opening the session of our CRCG workshop here. First of all, I wanted to welcome all of you here, and just to note that this is an interactive type of workshop. So to just kick it off, in the audience, how many of you are engineers? Please raise your hand. And how many of you are pharmacologists? Some of you may be both. How many of you are physicians? And so these are and how many of you have a nice, how many of you are human factors specialists, sociologists, et cetera, anthropologists? Great. Good to see the diverse representation here in the audience. In the audience, we have about 80 people. Online, we have close to 1,700 counting. And Visha can give you an update on how many people are joining us online. So with that, we can delve into these drug-device combination products. From the CEDAR angle for drug-device combination products, these products serve specific purposes. The main purpose for many of these drug-device combination products is drug delivery. And these are injectables, metered dosage forms, which include both topical and inhaled metered dosage forms, delivery of powders for inhalation, patches for topical products, implants, and both these patches and implants have a matrix substrate for which allow release of timed release of drugs. And then there are intrauterine drugs as well. Of note, these drug delivery aspects allow for careful, measured delivery of drugs in the context of some of these drugs have therapeutic indexes that require a very timed release of the drug or measured dosage of the drug. So these are important in the aspect of making sure that the dosage is delivered accurate and that there's not a failure to deliver these devices on time, these drugs on time. There are other types of drug device combination products that we regulate in CEDAR. These include drug modifying products, things with that heat up the drug, things that light activate the photoreactive drug. We also have products that mix API, where there are multiple APIs put together and then apply them for delivery. We also are seeing the advent of diagnostic products with sensors built in. And these may provide very unique aspects to allow for integrated delivery of drugs, allowing open and closed loop delivery of products for therapeutics. In the advent of digital health, we're seeing more software implemented into products. So these are some of the current challenges for the device aspects for what we're dealing with in CDER. Of note, FDA is not new to regulating the device constituents of products or devices in general. The CDRH was an offshoot of the original drug center, and those devices have been regulated as standalone entities over in CDRH for years, since the 1980s, with advent of medical device regulation statutes. So with those, in that context, those devices were regulated, we regulated those devices in the context of substantial equivalence under 510Ks and PMAs, depending on the risk of the devices. And that risk-based paradigm of regulating devices have served us well in the United States for many decades. In the context of what we're doing here in drugs and how we regulate devices as part of NDAs, as part of combination products, we're relatively new at this. We've been doing this for maybe the last 20 years or so. With that, I think there's a lot of opportunities and there's some challenges that we are working our way around, as you will see from today, from the two-day sessions that we have planned for today. This is part 2 of our CRCG venture into the world of drug device combination products. We had a 101 session of the basics of drug device combination products last year. So those that in the audience are interested, do go back and look at those recorded sessions where we discussed those products. These sessions for these 2 days are more advanced, and we expect that you all have sufficient expertise to jump into those and have the conversations that are needed to move this particular field forward. So among the challenges and opportunities for what we're doing, I think one big thing is human factors, the human interactions with devices, and how well are we able to use those products factor into the ability to use them correctly, the ability to deliver the product without catastrophic failures, and how do we work our way around nuanced changes in the drug products. So innovator companies will constantly look for angles on how to devise new drugs and new products where they might be able to patent some delivery system. For example, having a syringe that you can squeeze a lever instead of trigger the plunger down. So is that a unique delivery system? Yes, but does it add value to the healthcare system? That is something that isn't always measured. And in that context, can FDA rely on the predicate device, which would be the original syringe, where you're doing the plunger, which is a more simple mechanism for a generic product. And in that context, I would think potentially yes. So, and then you can also think about devising very complex products coming into the marketplace as a new drug company. So that's something that one might want to do. So you can have some IP in the or intellectual property in the game. But keep in mind that the more complex the device is, the more things can go wrong with the device, more difficult to manufacture, the harder it could be to sterilely fill the product, the more likely you're going to get a recall. And also the issues around usability. So some of these devices require training programs to get the delivery for the product. And yes, you're going to get an invested population of patients who know how to use a very specific device. But if the original predicate device was sufficient to get the drug product to the site of action as per our regulations 21 CFR 320, then shouldn't that be enough for a generic product? So these are questions that are raised in the big picture scheme of things as we move along in the drug device combination world. The other thing is what is the value added for having additional gadgets or pieces built into a product? And a lot of these new devices have yet to prove themselves. If adding a digital recording of administration of the device, is that better than say a diary, keeping a diary on drug delivery? And those have yet to be proven, and in that context is how does CDER regulate those kinds of products? And so these are all things that CDER is thinking about, and as we move forward in this area, we want to keep some of those things in mind. I think one could agree that for generics, we do want to make sure that the products work well for what's intended for the patient population that it's intended for. So we're interested in devising studies to look at how that could be done, what kind of surrogate populations might be usable if the populations are difficult to access. And also the many generic studies are done overseas. So how do you extrapolate studies done overseas to US population for some things? We have different languages, even in countries that speak English. There are sometimes differences in understanding and linguistics for addressing certain aspects. You can think of some examples of if any of our English-speaking colleagues from other countries around the world, we can share during our co-sessions. So with that, I'm going to move into the next session, next speaker. So in 2016, when I first joined the Office of Generic Drugs, having come from being the Chief Medical Officer over in CDRH, I worked with Rob Lionberger, and who's our office director, and we decided that it would be a nice thing to set up a team within our division just focused on the drug device combination products and assessing the devices. And our current lead medical officer for that group is Kate Feibus. And Kate Feibus has done fantastic job organizing this session, envisioning it and planning it. Kate, come up there. Thank you so much, folks. Appreciate it. Oh, Brandon, where's Brandon? Hey, Brandon.
And Brandon Wood is also coming out to join us. Dual effort.
Make sure I can work this right. All right. So welcome everybody and good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Wood. I am a Director of Regulatory Affairs for Teva Pharmaceuticals. I have had the pleasure of participating on the planning committee with Kate and FDA and the industry members for the last 2 years, and it's been a really excellent experience. I'm going to kick us off today with a brief overview of DDCP 101, or Drug Device Combination Products 101, from spring of 2023, and then I will hand the floor over to Dr. Katharine Feibus of FDA to give an overview of day one of the workshop. Our standard disclaimer slide. Okay, so where did we start? We started in May 2023, and it was a one-day hybrid interactive training. Ultimately, the objective was to support the efficient development of complex generic drug device combination products and to enhance the quality of ANDA submissions for these products. There were a whole range of topics discussed during this one-day workshop. One of the reasons that we moved to two, but ultimately we discussed identification of drug device combination products and the regulatory framework that defines them. We talked about comparative analyses and best practices prior to and for ANDA submission. including human factors and risk assessment and device development. We talked about navigating other differences, which, as Markham was just alluding to, is incredibly important, as well as really exciting OGD-funded research that could help to contribute to identifying other types of data that could support these differences. We also took a dive into the scientific and regulatory considerations to quality and performance of these products. And we wrapped up with a really fun, enhanced hands-on workshop between industry and FDA members working together in small groups. And I think that was important, working together, because I think that's part of the theme of this workshop in particular. Overall, the outcome was a success. It was one of the first hybrid FDA CRCG events. And at the end of the day, it was well attended, but the most important thing was that there was meaningful dialogue and discussion about the best practices, requirements, and challenges related to these types of products. Ultimately, as Markham also mentioned, I would highly suggest that you review the workshop from last year. It was titled 101 for a reason. It was a starting point, a building block to build on. In this year's workshop, it really was the foundation to build off of. So strongly suggest and implore you to take a look at the recordings and slides from last year's workshop. Visha, Anna, Jim, and the team do an excellent job of making sure that those materials are available. So let's make sure we use them from an industry perspective. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Katharine Feibus to give us an overview of day one. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. It's loud. So, good day, everybody. It's very exciting to, number one, see a full room here today, and also to have so many people joining us from various locations in the world online. How did you get this to them? Perfect. So let's take a look at how we're going to start this workshop off today. So once Brandon and I are done up here, we are going to begin with our plenary talk. This talk is on the barriers to entry for generic drug device combination products in the United States. And we are lucky to have Dr. William Feldman joining us from the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where he is an associate physician and also trains medical students and residents. From there, we will move into Symposium 1. And this symposium is titled Understanding the Landscape and Challenges for Development of Generic Drug Device Combination Products. For both of the symposiums, we are going to have presentations from FDA and industry. In Symposium 1, we are also lucky to have 2 patients joining us who need to use drug device combination products to manage their medical conditions every day. And they're going to share their experiences and perspectives with us. And hopefully we can all take that information and incorporate it into the work that we do every day to make sure that the products that we are developing and that we are regulating are really serving patients as they should. We're going to have a coffee break in the middle of Symposium 1, give everybody a chance to recharge, stretch their legs. And then after Symposium 1, we will have lunch. It's an opportunity for us all to network with each other, share information about where we come from and what we do every day. And again, to recharge for the afternoon, where we will have Symposium 2, assessment of other design differences for generic drug device combination products, current challenges, and future opportunities. And Symposium 2 really gets into the crux of the matter for this workshop. We know that there are pain points out there. We know that there are some aspects of comparative user interface assessment that can really be challenging for you, for FDA, for all of us. And we want to put our heads together and really think about how we can use our research opportunities, how we can use what we've learned to date to continue to grow and improve this area. Again, we're going to have presentations from various perspectives, followed by a panel discussion. And then between Symposium 2 and Symposium 3, we're going to try something that I like to call interfaith time with FDA. And we're going to have some generic drug leaders from the Office of Generic Drugs who will come up here and be available for you to ask them whatever questions come to you about how we regulate this area, what our thoughts are, and hopefully that will be an incredibly informative session. After we have a little bit more chance for more caffeine and carbs, we will move into Symposium 3. Symposium 3 will actually bridge both days. It's going to end day 1, and it's also going to be the start of day 2. And these are going to be 2 breakout working sessions where all of you who are here in person are going to have a chance to break out into smaller groups and work with each other to really take a look at where are we? What are our challenges right now? What are the resources we have to address these challenges? What resources do we need that we don't have yet? And what are the research questions that we should be asking and finding ways to answer so that we can continue to improve drug device combination products in the generic space? You can see the 4 topics listed there. And now that you've seen the overview for today, I would like to extend a huge thank you to our workshop planning committee. These folks have been working on developing this workshop for about 9 months. So as an OBGYN by training, I feel like I've come all the way through a pregnancy and we're now giving birth to this event today. You can see there was a lot of cross-disciplinary planning amongst members from FDA, industry, and from the Center for Research on Complex Generics, and everybody played an essential role. And so I just extend huge thanks out to everybody for your time, your effort, and for helping to run this workshop today. Special thanks to Sam Ronnie, who is our Associate Director of Research in the Office of Research and Standards, and he's sort of our guiding light with our whole CRCG collaborative program, as well as Fallon Smith, who is our communications staff person who's been really essential in getting information out to the community. And now I would like to invite William Feldman to the stage, Associate Physician, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Instructor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School. Thank you so much for sharing your research and knowledge with us today.
Good morning, everybody. Let me see if I can get this working. Sorry, I think, does the next presentation need to load? I don't know if anybody from IT. Oh, here it is. Amazing. Thank you. Great. So thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love talking about this stuff, and it's great for me. Usually I present at academic conferences, so it's really a pleasure to be here with folks from the FDA and industry. The title of my talk is Barriers to Entry for Generic Drug Device Combinations in the US. We'll be talking about a few particular areas, but first I just want to give my disclosures. I serve as a consultant for a nonprofit called Alosa Health and Edion. I've served as an expert witness in litigation against inhaler manufacturers, and the funding for a lot of the work that I'm presenting today comes from the NHLBI, the Commonwealth Fund, and Arnold Ventures. So the agenda is fairly simple. We're going to talk about patents and device hops. We're going to talk about litigation, and we're going to talk about thresholds for approval at the FDA. Obviously, these are not the only barriers to generic entry in the United States, but these are the ones we're going to focus on in this talk. Before we dive in, I always like to highlight that while these seem like niche products, these are among the costliest products in the US. If you look at the top 50 drugs by gross Medicare Part D spending in 2021, 40% were drug device combinations: Humira, Lantus, Ozempic, Trelegy, Ellipta, Symbicort. These are products that cost the U.S. healthcare system billions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars each year. And those are that's gross spending if you look at revenue of brand name manufacturers. More recently, roughly a third of the top 50 drugs are drug device combinations. A good number of these are biologics, but you can see on the list above, Ozempic, Trelegy, Symbicort, these are all small molecule drugs. We'll be talking today about small molecule drugs, and I'll start with patents and device ops. The two case studies that will animate this talk are inhalers and GLP-1 receptor agonists. Those are widely used classes of meds for different diseases. One's obviously inhaled, other is injected. And I think of the classes of drug device combinations, these have been historically ones where we spent the most money as a healthcare system. So I'll just define a few key terms. So patents are granted by the USPTO. They generally last 20 years from the time of filing. Companies can get multiple patents on a given product. So patents on the active ingredient, which we refer to as primary patents. So for example, tiotropium. Companies can get patents on inactive ingredients, uses, formulations that we refer to as secondary patents. And then in the case of drug device combinations, companies can get patents on the device itself. So for example, the Respimat device that houses tiotropium, and we refer to these as tertiary patents. Non-patent statutory exclusivities are granted by the FDA. They vary in duration. So new chemical entity exclusivities are 5 years and pediatric exclusivities are 6 months. But both patents and non-patent statutory exclusivities can serve to block generic competitors from launching. And then device hops are a term that we coined that referred to moving old active ingredients from one device to another. So to go back to the example of Spiriva, the move from tiotropium in Spiriva HandiHaler with one NDA to Spiriva Respimat with a different NDA. These are a smattering of device patents. Honestly, I don't even recall which product I pulled these from, so I don't have to mention which product I pulled these from, but you see these on similar types of patents on all of the inhalers that are marketed. Patents on small parts, so piston pumping system, microstructured filter, the nozzle, every aspect of these products ends up getting patented. And patents matter a lot because they have this special regulatory status in the US. In the US, manufacturers list key patents in the Orange Book, which the FDA releases each year. The FDA does not police what goes into the Orange Book. It serves in what it refers to as a purely ministerial role. And when patents are listed in the Orange Book, the FDA cannot approve a generic drug for marketing until the patents either expire or challenged. And these challenges, which we'll come back to, can be costly and lead to litigation, which can cause delays. So we'll talk first about patents on inhalers, how they can serve to limit generic entry, and then we'll talk about GLP-1 receptor agonists. This is the very first inhaler approved by the FDA and first meter dose inhaler approved by the FDA in 1956, the MediHaler Epi and MediHaler ISO. So these products have been around for a very long time. We looked at all inhalers approved from 1986 to 2020 to get a sense of the kinds of patents that companies are using and how they're using these patents. You don't have to worry about the jumble of acronyms of the classes, but basically all inhalers have one of 4 different mechanisms of action for asthma or COPD: a steroid, a beta agonist, muscarinic antagonist, and a mast cell stabilizer. These get there have been long-acting versions created, and then they get combined, so you get a total of 10 therapeutic classes. Over the last few decades, the FDA approved 62 inhalers, 53 of which were brand name products, 9 of which were generics. And I'll just note that you see the under generic albuterol, there were chlorofluorocarbon-containing generic products on the market in the 90s that were subsequently pulled with the CFC ban in the 2000s. Today, there are 5, since the study was completed, there are a total of 5 brand name inhalers that have any generic competitors out of the dozens that have been approved over the last few decades. A few key points from our research that I want to highlight. So of these 62 inhalers that have been approved, The only one with an active ingredient that had a new mechanism of action was ipratropium in 1986. So every single inhaler approved after 1986 has had the same mechanism of action as inhalers approved earlier for asthma and COPD. We see a growth in the number of patents that the brand name inhaler manufacturers are getting. If you look in the first decade to the third of our study, we see a median of 2 patents filed at the time of approval. Early on, in the last decade, up to 11 patents, and the median number of device patents has grown alongside the median number of total patents. Companies file patents after approval, so 25 inhalers received post-approval patents, 91 patents in all, and these patents extended the duration of protection for 12 of the products with a median extension of 6 years. A fourth key point to note from our research is that device patents represented a majority of patents that have been listed on these products. Of the 137 distinct device patents in the cohort, more than 3/4 made no mention of active ingredients. And I highlight this because there's been a court ruling and some FTC action recently that has really called this practice into question. The court ruling was a case involving Lantus, and the court found that the brand name manufacturer had improperly listed a patent on the Solastar pen because the patent made no mention of the active ingredient and was too disconnected from the drug product to be listed in the Orange Book. Again, the FDA doesn't police this, but the court found that this should not have been listed in the Orange Book and that it could constitute an antitrust violation. Fast forward to November of 2023, the FTC released a list of 110 patents that it has deemed to be improperly listed in the Orange Book. And the majority of these are patents on inhalers that are these device-only patents that make no mention of active ingredients. So this is kind of a rapidly evolving landscape. One company, GSK, has opted to pull these patents from the Orange Book. The other brand name manufacturers have not. It's not clear what the FTC will do next, but just to highlight in our research, what we found is that, again, 3/4 of all the device patents that are listed by brand name manufacturers in the Orange Book, if you apply the same logic as the court applied in the Lantus case, as the FTC is applying, the majority of those, 3/4 of those should not be listed in the Orange Book. A fifth point is we found the median duration of overall expected protection from patents and exclusivities was 16.2 years on these products, with the last to expire patent being a device patent 53% of the time. In only one case did a generic enter early. So remember, generics can challenge patents in what are called paragraph 4 certifications. But we, in our study, found only one instance in which a generic company had entered before patents expired on the brand name product, and that was for ProAir. The generic was approved in 2020. And then the last point to note is this idea of device hopping. So we found 15 different originator inhalers that pursued this strategy of device hopping that led to 19 different follow-on brand name products. Manufacturers for these products received a median of 28.1 years of protection when you start from the FDA approval of the very first product until the last to expire patent of the last product. And I'll show you in a moment how that looks graphically. A chunk of these were related to the CFC ban. So a question I get asked a lot is, aren't a lot of these device hops, weren't they just from CFC containing inhalers to HFA inhalers? And the answer is yes, some of those certainly were, but more than half of these device hops were not from CFC containing inhalers to other types of inhalers. So here, just to show you kind of what's going on, I'll draw your attention to where my arrow is pointed to fluticasone. So you can see that GSK has released 5 different inhalers containing fluticasone starting in the mid-90s. this original CFC containing Flovent, then Flovent Rotodisc, Flovent Discus, Flovent HFA, and then our new Ellipta, which contains a longer acting form of fluticasone. But you can see that the FDA approval of the first was in the mid-90s, and the last to expire patent on the most recent fluticasone product, our new Ellipta, is expiring in 2031. So you see these very, very long periods of market exclusivity for old active ingredients that get new lives in new devices. And these are products, some of the ones on the prior page were many of them were CFC containing products, but these are all products that contain no CFCs. So Advair Discus and Advair HFA, ProAir HFA and ProAir Respiclick, products where these are device hops that weren't really required by the FDA. So how are manufacturers using the patent system to preserve market exclusivity? Developing new products in old classes, filing an increasing number of patents before FDA approval, extending protection through further patents after FDA approval, filing numerous device patents that courts in the USPTO have been now calling into question, managing to avoid challenges to their patents by generic manufacturers, and then engaging in this strategy of device hopping. And turning to GLP-1 receptor agonists, so I should say, I got interested in inhalers. I am trained as a pulmonologist and critical care doctor, and I got really interested in this topic when I was a fellow in 2017, when there were 0 generic inhalers on the US market. And we've since, as a research group, started looking at other drug device combinations. So we did a similar study with GLP-1 receptor agonists. These, of course, the first GLP-1 receptor agonist was approved in 2005 compared to the first metered-dose inhaler that was approved in 1956. So much less experience with these products. But we see kind of the early goings of very similar strategies. Proliferation of products in the same class. You can see all of the GLP-1 receptor agonists that are regulated as small molecule drugs that are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. There are a smattering that are regulated as biologics. We see a median of 19.5 patents per product, with 17 filed before FDA approval, and then a median of 1.5 filed after FDA approval for expected market exclusivity of 18 years. Most of the patents on these products are on the delivery devices. Here's an example of Ozempic. 84% of the patents listed in the Orange Book are on the delivery devices, with not a single one mentioning the active ingredient. So if depending on where everything goes with court rulings and the USPTO, the FTC, you could imagine a lot of these patents getting pulled from the Orange Book, which may clear the way for more timely generic competition. In the case of GLP-1s, there's still no generic competitor on the US market. We saw one device hop by Durian Pen to B-size. So at the end of each of these sections, I'm going to pose a set of I think, provocative, controversial questions that you're welcome to ask me about, or we could talk about during the breaks. But, the questions that we've thought about on our research team is the threshold for granting patents to the USPTO sufficiently high? Some studies suggest that the European Patent Office does not grant patents as liberally as the USPTO. Are there ways to make sure that only high quality patents are getting through in the first place? What role should the FDA play in policing the Orange Book, if any? It would require an enormous amount of resources for the FDA to start scrutinizing patents that are listed in the Orange Book, but currently it serves in this purely ministerial role. And then how far should the FTC go in seeking to delist these device-only patents, and what effect will this have on generic competition? So that's the patent side of things. And a question that naturally comes up is, yes, the companies are listing all of these patents, but why don't we see more successful litigation to get early generic entry for these products? So I'll talk a little bit about litigation and make sure we're still good on time, which we are. So how does the system of challenging patents work? So generic firms can challenge patents listed in the Orange Book as either invalid, unenforceable, or not infringed when they file their ANDAs, known as Paragraph 4 certifications. The Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 incentivizes these types of challenges by giving the first to file generic challenger up to 180 days of market exclusivity. And then if the brand name firm files litigation within 45 days of receiving notice of the paragraph 4, they get an automatic 30-month stay that prevents the FDA from approving the generic for marketing. So huge incentives for brand name companies to list patents in the Orange Book because regardless of whether those patents end up holding or not, they trigger these automatic 30-month stays. So we looked at all of the paragraph 4 certifications on inhalers over the last several decades, and we saw that for the 53 brand name inhalers approved from 1986 to 2020, generic firms filed paragraph 4 challenges on only 7 products. The median time from FDA approval of the brand name product to first paragraph 4 was 14 years. In other cohorts of drugs, we see much shorter times where you're seeing earlier paragraph 4 challenges being filed, 7, 8 years after the brand name approval, even earlier at times. And manufacturers sued for infringement, brand name firms sued for infringement for 68 patents, 62%, nearly 2/3 of which were device patents. So companies are listing these device patents, and then when generic firms are filing paragraph 4s, they're suing for infringement of those device patents. They're not just sitting in the Orange Book, but they're being used in a strategy of litigation. The paragraph 4 challenges of the 7 that we found, only 2 at the time of our study completion had resulted in approved generics, and that was for ProAir HFA and Symbicort. The first generic for ProAir HFA hit the U.S. market in 2020, which was 16 years after the brand name approval, and the first generic of Symbicort hit in 2023, 17 years after that approval. There is a generic version of Spiriva that has subsequently hit the U.S. market that also had a paragraph 4. But the take home here is there's just not there's not been a lot of paragraph 4s, and of the ones that there were not very many successful ones that resulted in approved generic products. Turning to the GLP-1s, we see a very different landscape where 5 of the 10 drug device combinations, GLP-1 drug device combinations, have already had patent challenges. There have been 30 lawsuits with 70 patents included that have been involved in these lawsuits. And again, more than half of which are patents on the delivery devices. So companies listing delivery device patents and then using them in litigation. So again, a set of, I think, hopefully provocative questions to think about from a policy and regulatory standpoint. Should we be better incentivizing generics to challenge patents on complex products, right? Everybody, no matter whether you're challenging patents on tablets or really complex inhaled products, it's 180 days of market exclusivity for the first to file generic firms. Should we think, and by we I mean Congress, should Congress think about extending period of market exclusivity for first to file generics on complex products like inhalers and other drug device combinations? And then on the flip side, is 30 months, is that too long for automatic stays that brand name firms get whenever they file litigation in response to a paragraph 4 challenge? And then the last area, so we've talked about patents as barriers to generic entry. We've talked about litigation as barriers to generic entry. And then the last topic I just want to touch on are the thresholds for generic approval at the FDA. And I have to say, I've never talked to an audience that knows more about this than the audience that I'm talking to right now, of folks who know intimately how challenging this can be. So I'm really not going to spend much time talking about what you all have to do to get through the FDA with generic drug device combinations. But what I want to talk about is some work that we've been doing in our research group to think about using real-world evidence in the post-marketing setting to look at generic versus brand name drug device combinations, right? So a lot of the focus for these workshops are leading up to approval. But what we've been doing is saying, okay, let's look at how do the generic products compare to the brand name products when we look after approval. So the very first brand name maintenance inhaler to receive FDA approval was a generic version of Advair Discus, fluticasone salmeterol, called Wixela Inhub. And what we do, we use these huge insurance claims databases with millions of covered lives, and we look at folks who start the brand name product versus folks who start the generic product. We adjust for dozens upon dozens of potential confounders. So severity of COPD, medications that folks were on, healthcare utilization, all sorts of things to adjust to make sure that the two groups are similar of the generic and the brand name users. And of course, we expect them to be similar, right? Because it's a little bit arbitrary who's getting the generic and who's getting the brand name. And without going into a ton of detail, because I want to save a little bit of time for questions, what we found in this first study is that the generic version did exactly the same as the brand name version. It functioned just as well when we looked at the key effectiveness outcome of COPD exacerbations, and then a key safety outcome of pneumonia hospitalization. So inhaled corticosteroids are, of course, associated with pneumonia, but we saw very similar hazards of both. And this is what our sensitivity analyses look like. So for moderate or severe COPD exacerbations, I won't get into the details of what every single sensitivity analysis is, but what we do is we vary how we define the outcome, we vary how long we follow patients, give ourselves every opportunity to observe any potential signal that somehow the generic might not be doing as well as the brand name version. And we saw no evidence of that in any of the sensitivity analyses. So hazard ratios at 1 mean no difference. Greater than 1 would favor Advair Discus, less than 1 would favor the generic, and you see everything clustered right around 1. And then same thing for pneumonia hospitalizations, wider confidence intervals because we have fewer outcomes, but sort of a lot of sensitivity analyses to sort of reassure us that the generic is functioning in the real world with patients who are getting these products in the real world with whatever education they're getting in the real world, the generic product functioning just as well as the brand name. And so my final set of provocative questions, maybe these are the most provocative, but should the FDA have more flexibility in approving drug device combinations, generic drug device combinations that differ from brand name reference products? And could the routine collection and analysis of post-marketing real world evidence help with further flexibility up front, right? If we were doing these types of surveillance studies routinely, you could imagine a little bit more flexibility at the time of approval with observations after approval for any potential safety signals that could prompt further study or further investigation. So I will stop there. I think we have a couple minutes for questions. So I'm love to, if anybody has questions. If not, I'm glad to answer questions afterwards. Just want to acknowledge the funders of a lot of our research, and then my research team at Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital. My contact info is below.
Okay, we have some microphones. Anyone would like to ask a question?
So you talked a little bit about listing patents. So, and if you change the patent listing process, there are different things, but even if a patent isn't listed, right, the brand companies can still sue the generics can still lose. Like, I'm curious for you, maybe other people in the audience, like how big, how important is the listing system versus actually just patenting things, whether or not I list them in the Orange Book or not?
Right. So it's a great point. So absolutely, it is the case that generic firms could get sued after the fact if they have patents. If all of these device patents get delisted, could they get sued after the fact? And the answer is yes. And it's a fine balance, right? Do we want the Orange Book provides transparency so generic firms know what they're up against, but on the other hand, it can lead to sort of patents on dose counters that we see in inhalers that are clogging up these ANDA applications requiring paragraph 4s. So I don't think it solves all of the problems. I think we need to make, at the side of the USPTO, we have to make sure that only good patents are getting through in the first place. But I do think that firms are good at figuring out what these patents are, even without the Orange Book. We see that in the biologic space where there is no Orange Book equivalent where all key patents have to be listed. And so there's a trade-off, but I worry that we've shifted, when you see dozens of patents that are all on the delivery device of these products with decades-old active ingredients that make it hard to file. And as I worry that maybe we've shifted too far with these patents lists in the Orange Book. But it's a very, very good question.
Thank you. How would you suggest using post-marketing data before marketing approval? Or, you're talking about real-world evidence. How would you incorporate that into a pre-market decision?
It couldn't be incorporated pre-market because you could only gather it post-market. But
Sure.
I think that you could imagine a system, and you see this on the brand name side where the FDA is willing, with accelerated approval.
I was thinking of that and thinking it doesn't always work out well.
No, it doesn't always work well. Right, that's right. And
Yeah.
our research group has been very critical of the accelerated approval process. But I
Right.
think in this case, you could imagine a system with slightly more flexibility upfront. Maybe the user interface doesn't have to be quite as close to the user interface, knowing that real world evidence is going to be collected after the fact. And if there's any safety signal, it gets followed up upon, right? So it's the evidence would only, you would only collect it later, and it's a hard question because we want to have as rigorous standards as we can for FDA approval of complex generic products. But it's something I've thought a lot about could real world evidence here be useful in reassuring us in a system where there's slightly more flexibility before approval.
Right. I mean, I could imagine a situation where it's, the third in a class almost of devices, the way you think of classes of drugs. But I don't know how exactly to do that. So thank
Right.
you.
Hi, and we can take this offline if it's too long of a question, but I just had a curiosity on your study that you conducted on the comparative effectiveness. What were your measuring criteria to establish that they were effective on both sides? Was it just from the clinical aspect, or was there a usability human factors aspect?
So, yeah, so basically we have these huge claims databases, and what we're using are codes for hospitalizations for a COPD exacerbation or a pneumonia. So we can see whenever a patient fills a prescription for either inhaler, and then we follow them out in time, and we can see when were they ever first hospitalized for a COPD exacerbation, when were they hospitalized for a pneumonia, for pneumonia, and those are the outcomes. So we have no idea if people are using the devices well. We have no idea if they got education about how they were used. It's purely, and there's pros and cons of these real world studies. They're great because they're pragmatic. They're just in the actual clinical practice for folks who are actually getting the generic, actually getting the brand name. What happens? Do they have similar outcomes or not? There's so many errors in inhaler use. As a pulmonologist, I mean, I see it all the time. Very few people use their inhaler like they're supposed to be using it. Probably injector pens, it's less of an issue, but what's nice about these types of studies is doesn't matter how they're using it. Assume that they're mistakes, but that whatever mistakes are being made with the generic are also being made on the Advair side and on the brand name side, and the outcomes are the same. And I think that's, to me, quite reassuring evidence for the FDA. When we finished the study, it's like the FDA got it right. Generic, this was a good approval. It seems to be functioning exactly the same.
Okay, here is a couple of questions from the online, but because of the limit of time, I'm going to cast it too. So first question was, what was the final resolution on 100 patient challenges?
Sorry, what's that?
What was the final resolution on 100 patient
Oh, what was
patent
the-
challenges?
Yeah, so the resolution of the patent challenges, it is a hot topic ongoing. So 10 firms were implicated, 4 brand name inhaler manufacturers. One of them removed their patents, GSK, 3 others haven't. And it's not clear, the FTC hasn't announced next steps yet for what they plan to do in terms of further investigating. And I should say, it was all mostly inhalers and generic epinephrine pens. So none of the GLP-1 patents that we talked about in the talk today have been mentioned. But if we apply the same logic as the FTC seems to be applying, there are a lot of device patents in the Orange Book that probably need to get pulled. They've just scratched the surface, I think, with the first 110.
Thank you. So your sensitivity analysis you showed on different patient, does that include device performance related analysis like any compatibility or any adverse event or anything from the MAUD device database, which is from the manufacturer side on adverse events?
So we don't have any, we always see you're starting it's just one product, the Wixela Inhub versus Advair Discus. And so so the answer to the question is we didn't do anything other than allow people to start one of those two and then observe what happens when they started one versus the other. We couldn't vary, we didn't look at other types of generics for the same product. There hadn't been any approved. That was the very first one at the time that we did this study. So it's the type of data that we have are wonderful clinical data in some respects with huge numbers of patients. You see all their comorbidities, all their medication fills, but we lack lots of data from the clinical side on pulmonary function testing. What did their spirometry look like? I would love to know that, but we can't see that in the data that we have. And we're not varying, I think back to the question before, we don't know how people are using these products, and we're not varying anything around, different different standards of performance when being evaluated by the FDA or anything like that. We're just saying, here's an approved generic, here's a longstanding brand name. How do they compare it?
Yeah, so I believe that sensitivity analysis is based on the clinical aspect of the delivery or maybe the efficacy side, but not on the safety side.
And it's really based on design choices. So for example, we follow people until they stop their medication. How do you define stopping a medication? Usually you give a grace period between fills. And so we varied the grace period 30 days to 60 days to 90 days to say, if we observe people for longer periods of time with longer grace periods permitted between fills, does that change the outcome? So most of those sensitivity analyses are those types of methodologic design choices to kind of reassure us that it wouldn't be different if we were doing the study differently. The ideal would be a randomized trial, of course, but
we're a little behind
Thank
schedule. But to address your issue on post-market safety, FDA does keep track of post-market safety of generic products, and there have been no notable signals to date for the specific Advair generic product that was mentioned. Thank you.
We will invite Dr. Feldman to join the panel discussion one. So if there are additional questions, please save them for the panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Feldman.
A very good morning to all our in-person attendees, and I would extend a warm welcome to all our virtual attendees today. We'll now get started with Symposium 1. I'm Karthika Natarajan. I am with Office of Research and Standards, Office of Generic Drugs, FDA. Symposium 1 will focus on understanding the landscape and the challenges for development of generic drug device combination products. Thank you for the excellent talk on the challenges due to patents, Dr. Feldman. The presenters today, first speaker will be Lisa Bercu. She's a Senior Regulatory Counsel with Division of Policy Development, Office of Generic Drug Policy, OGD FDA. She'll be talking about general policy updates today, which will be followed by 2 industry speakers. We'll have Johannes Keuschnigg, who's the Regulatory Devices Portfolio Head from Sandoz, who will walk us through some of the challenges and opportunities in generic drug device combination product development, which will be followed by Tim Briggs, who's going to walk us through some of the challenges faced when developing a drug device combination product, a generic version for a discontinued RLD. We'll have a short break, which will be followed by patient perspectives. We have Sarah Ibrahim, who's an Associate Director for Stakeholder and Global Engagement from the Office of Generics FDA. She'll facilitate a patient discussion session. As Katharine mentioned, patients will be providing their perspectives on the difficulties they face when they go through a generic drug device combination product substitution. We'll then have a panel discussion where we'll take questions for all the speakers. We'll also be taking questions for Dr. Feldman during this panel discussion session. So if you have any questions, please hold on till the panel discussion session. Without any further ado, let me invite Lisa Bercu to the stage, please. Thank you.
So that was a tough act to follow. I'm glad Dr. Feldman's joining because now all of the tough questions can be directed at him instead of us FDAers, right? Okay. How do I? Yeah. There we go. So you just one? Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm in charge of just setting the stage for us today. I don't think this is going to be kind of a mind-blowing presentation and should shock you, but it's really to set the stage for, why we're talking about sameness today and to give you some awareness of the policy documents that we've issued over the past couple of years. So first I'm going to talk about our statutory and regulatory sameness considerations. Then I'll go over some policy documents that I think will be really helpful to be aware of as we're working through this conference today. And then some tips for developing and submitting an ANDA for a generic combination product. So first, why do we legally care about sameness at FDA? Why the focus on it? And it's really all grounded in our authorizing statute. So if you look at Section 505J of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it says that an ANDA generally must contain information to show that the proposed generic drug product is the same as that RLD with respect to active ingredients, conditions of use, route of administration, dosage form, strength, and labeling, with certain permissible differences. And I'll go a little bit more into that on the next slide, and that it must be bioequivalent to the RLD. These considerations apply to generic products and, of course, also apply to generic combination products. And then turning to our definition of therapeutic equivalence, they have to be, as you know, bioequivalent, pharmaceutically equivalent, and must or can be expected to have that same clinical effect and safety profile when administered to patients under the conditions specified in the labeling. So that's why when you hear today all about, well, does this have the same clinical effect and safety profile as the RLD? Or if you see that in our communications to you, so if you see it in a complete response letter or in our guidances, that's where that language is coming from. It's grounded in our definition of therapeutic equivalence because an approved drug product is presumed to be therapeutically equivalent to its RLD. So turning to labeling considerations, as I mentioned on the last slide, generic drug product labeling generally must be the same as that RLD. One of those exceptions to that is if they're distributed by different manufacturers. And so what we've said is that certain labeling differences that flow from permissible differences in design may be permissible and will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So on my very basic lawyerly explanation of this would be is if you have an RLD and it has a red button and a generic comes in with a green button and we decide that that difference in color is acceptable, that means that labeling reflecting that difference in color would also generally be acceptable under that same labeling requirement under our statute. And then another thing I wanted to point out, particular for this conference today, is that an ANDA can contain differences from the RLD, but that clinical investigations can't be necessary to establish safety and effectiveness. So as you know, a generic is relying on the safety and effectiveness finding for that RLD and showing sameness to the RLD. So when we are trying to think, outside of the box the next couple of days about what kind of data can be submitted to support an other design difference, those studies other than CUHF studies, this is just a guardrail to keep in mind as we're coming up with ideas and talking about it. Okay, so turning to some policy documents that I think are going to be helpful to keep in your back pocket over the next 2 days. I have 3 slides of these, so I apologize, but hopefully they will be helpful. The first slide really talks about user interface considerations and then just some higher level combo product guidance documents. So the first one I think everyone should be aware of. It's our comparative analysis guidance. The second item I included here is one you might be a little less familiar with. This is a map we issued a couple of years ago. MAP means Manual of Policies and Procedures, and we issue these in CEDAR. And this describes the Office of Generic Drugs and the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology's roles for assessing comparative analysis and CUHF studies. So if you ever have questions about who does what in FDA regarding this assessment, this is where you can turn to look at that. I also included here a draft guidance that we issued just a couple of months ago on prescription drug use related software. This is something that the comment period recently closed and we're considering comments on. And then a higher level guidance, principles of pre-market pathways for combination products. This is almost combo products 101. And so if you have questions about, how we review combination products, how to determine what submission type, which most likely in your case might not be as much of an issue given what we're here to talk about, but this is where you could turn for that information. These documents are more geared for tomorrow. So they're quality focused documents. So the first one is on pen jet and related injectors. The second one here is on technical considerations for demonstrating reliability of emergency use injectors. I've included a guidance on glass syringes. And then the last 2 are really based on our recommendations are part 4. So post-market safety reporting and CGMP requirements for combination products. And then finally, this last slide is intended to capture those documents that will provide information on the best way to provide feedback or get feedback from us. So the first one is our GDUFA 3 commitment letter. If you haven't ever taken a look at it, I recommend doing so. This provides, our agreements that we made to you, to industry on ways to provide that we will provide feedback to you and timelines will provide feedback within. I included our formal meetings guidance here. This goes into much more detail, particularly for those product development meetings. You'll hear a lot about pre-ANDA meetings the next couple of days, our guidance on controls. And then I also included the map here on how we classify complex products. And so this will be helpful as you think about whether your product is eligible for a product development meeting. If you want to know what guidances are coming up, you can look at our CEDAR guidance agenda. Within that document, there's a section on generics. So you can just Control F and get to it and you'll see what's coming out in the generic space. Okay, so just turning to some high level tips. One, and once again, you'll hear this many times the next couple of days, is really to request our feedback early and often. So here I just included some examples of things that industry has sought our feedback on in the past. One is if you have questions about whether your proposed product is a combination product, Kate Feibus' team will answer that question, so you can always come to us with that. Also, if you would like our feedback on differences between the user interface of your proposed product as compared to the RLD. So submit, your comparative analysis to us and request feedback on that. I included a citation to our controls guidance because that contains a section in that guidance is on user interface assessment and what information to submit in a control. Of course, if you want to discuss your proposal to address another design difference, so this could be a CUHF study or something else, to come talk to us about that. And then something which I think is a little less known because it's newer in GDUFA 3, to discuss a new CUHF study to address deficiencies that were identified in your CRL, and you can do that via a post-CRL scientific meeting request. This next one is to conduct comparative analysis against the RLD. We've already, I think everybody here knows that the RLD is the drug that we've identified upon which you can rely in seeking approval. But there have been times where applicants have come to us and they said, we can't access physical samples of the RLD. Could we do this against the reference standard, for example? But ultimately, that comparative analysis should be conducted against the RLD. And if you would like our feedback on alternative ways to conduct your comparative analysis, particularly if you can't access the RLD, you can seek feedback from us. Also, there have been situations where you can't access the labeling. It's not available online or easily accessed. And so that's something you could talk to us about too. And then finally, I just want to comment on the scope of the conference. The scope here is really on generic combination products. If you have questions about biosimilars or interchangeables, they fall outside of the scope of this conference today. So in that situation, I recommend just reaching out to the Rate Review Division and FDA. And that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I would like to invite Johannes Keuschnigg to the stage, please.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody here in the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody attending online. And thanks, Lisa, for giving me now 10 minutes more time for my talk. So now I'm going to manage to finish in time, hopefully. So my name is Johannes Keuschnigg, and I'm a device regulatory portfolio head at Sondo. After we have now received the introduction on the regulatory framework for substitutability, in my talk, I'm going to give you our industry perspective on the challenges we face when developing such generic combination products for substitutability, and also provide some opportunities that we see how these challenges might be addressed. Nope. Nobody has managed that so far, so. Okay, disclaimer, basically the presentation is for information purpose only. So before I go more into the topic of substitutability, just a couple of words on the landscape and the framework that we are working under. So what do we actually need to do, or what do we want to achieve when we develop a generic combination product? So what we need to ensure, what we need to achieve is that we have a product that delivers the core safety and effectiveness requirements. And if you want to achieve therapeutic equivalence, we need to make sure that this user interface is therapeutically equivalent or substitutable. The way we do this, or what we need to establish to show this, is that we need to establish the data that demonstrates that the device constituent parts and the overall combination products really facilitate the achievement or the delivery of those core requirements. This data includes such, for example, functional data, functional performance data like design verification, material safety, stability, and so on. And the special topic then of usability engineering or human factors, where we need to cover the situation that you have a user who is experienced with the RLD coming to the pharmacy with his usual prescription, but then instead of getting the RLD, getting the generic product substituted for the RLD with no healthcare professional intervention and or no additional training. And in that situation, we need to make sure that user, even getting the generic version of the product, will have then the same clinical effect and the same safety profile as the RLD. The way how we do this is really by following the FDA guidance on the comparative analysis and, if required, comparative use human factor studies. And I will go into more detail on that in the next slides. So what is now our industry perspective? So what are the challenges that we face when we try to find the balance between matching the RLD user interface with an increasing need also for patient-friendly innovation? And here on the one side, I have the, kind of like a bucket where I listed some of the differentiation drivers that can push our product in some cases to differ from the RLD. I mean, like we heard also before already, the RLD and at the stage or at the time when the generic product can enter the market, the RLD can be already approved and on the market for a long period of time. And I mean, luckily, the state of the art science, it evolves also at the stage when the generic product can be submitted and can enter the market. The RLD is not necessarily state of the art anymore. So we kind of like would not like to be forced to develop a product that is not state of the art simply to be able to match the RLD. Similarly, if that product is on the market already, so if the RLD is on the market for a longer period of time, there is likely going to be data available, post-market data that might indicate or maybe even clearly show that there are some specific use errors that more or less frequently occur with the RLD. And I mean, just following the standard design control process, your risk management process will even like force you or push you to try to address these known use errors. And I mean, the first route of addressing known use errors would be by addressing them by design. So would push you away from the user interface of the RLD. The other extreme is that, like in some cases, we actually want or need to initiate the development of the generic product even before the RLD is approved or on the market. So in those cases, we don't necessarily know exactly how the RLD will look like. I mean, we're going to have a pretty good idea what direction it goes in, but when the question comes to what exactly the constituent parts are that they are using, we might be in the dark. We might not know that. Another point is that the development of a combination product, I mean, it's not a simple feat, or it requires time, effort, resources. And the main reason to develop this kind of product, I mean, like Markham also mentioned before, or they are safe, they are effective, and they are convenient for the users. And if we already invest this effort to develop such a product, I mean, it would be really appreciated if we have then the possibility to improve this user experience and not just simply to make it nicer, but maybe by improving this user experience, also increase the adherence to a dosing regimen for the users, really like improve the product and the user experience. And I mean, industry perspective, or I mean, there is also like a marketing aspect. In many cases, or in most cases, there will be several generic companies trying to market generic versions of the same RLD. So in such a case, if you're in a crowded marketplace, you might want or even need to distinguish your product in one or more ways from the competition so that it stands out and becomes like a commercially successful product instead of one that you have developed but then gathers dust on the shelves. On the other side, there is kind of like the objective or ideal state. So the state where we would like to end up in. So like I mentioned, we really want to be able to develop a product that is state of the art and not having to do something that has been done 10, 15, 20 years ago. Addressing known use errors or simply following design control process, we want to have the possibility to address safety or effectiveness concerns that are kind of like indicated by the known use errors. And also implementation of user interface improvements, possibility to do that would be greatly appreciated. So overall, we want to ensure really access, innovation, and flexibility for the generic version of an RLD. However, when you look in the middle, I put here one wall that kind of like reflects the legal restrictions that we're facing. So patents, trademarks, intellectual property that can prevent us really from copying the user interface of the RLD, which we would, however, more or less need to do to overcome the second wall, which is like the stringent regulatory requirements that we need to fulfill in order to show that our product really is substitutable for the RLD. And I mean, those are two separate walls here, but they are not independent of each other, or I mean, they work together and can then make the situation even worse for us as a generic industry. But what exactly now is the challenge? So what is the problem? I mean, you could ask, why is generic industry not simply developing the product that we feel we need to develop so that it's state of the art and so on, and then do like the exercise, follow the FDA guidance and identify differences and so on, and then follow the process that is described in the guidance to address them. And here the answer really is, the challenge is that other or non-minor differences that we do identify, they can really pose a prohibitive barrier for the development of a generic combination product. I mean, the overall design control process or the requirement that we need to follow to develop a product, it's not so different between an innovative one and a generic one. Or I mean, design control process 21 CFR 820 is the same that applies to both types of products. I mean, of course, the generic one, we need to make sure we have the same dosage form, same route of administration as the RLD and so on. But the overall process, design input, output, verification, validation, and so on, is the same. The part where it then differs is really like the approach to design validation or human factors engineering. So while the innovative companies usually have like the standard process, formative, summative, validation study, human factor studies, the generic industry follows then the process of the comparative analysis to compare this user interface and to kind of like build this scientific bridge to the RLD that allows us then to extrapolate the findings of safety and effectiveness in the context of usability from the RLD to our generic product. So this comparative analysis, it consists really of three parts, or the physical comparison, the comparative task analysis, and the labeling comparison. Once you have done that, the outcome will be that you have a list of potential differences, and these differences then need to be classified into either being minor or being non-minor in the context of external critical design attributes and critical tasks. Once you have done that, if you end up with having like no or only minor differences, then that's really great. That could mean that like you have already done your exercise and you can conclude your usability engineering effort with that. However, if you do have other differences or non-minor differences, then the option you have is to address those differences by going back to the beginning, to the drawing board, and addressing them through design change by either minimizing or completely removing these design differences. However, I mean, at this stage, you're already like quite far progressed in your development. So if you don't really want to go back to the complete beginning, the other option is to address those differences through additional data, such as is described in the guidance, these comparative use human factor studies. And I mean, while the title still includes the term human factor study, I mean, as you all know, this is not the same type of study like a formative or a summative study, or this is much more akin to a clinical trial or a clinical study, since it is a statistically powered study with a non-inferiority design. This statistical comparison that you need to do between the use error rates between the generic combination product and the RLD, they have really, in the end, a potentially very high up to prohibitive impact. The reasons for that, for us, for industry, is really, since you need to establish or need to compare the use error rates of the RLD with your product, you need to test both products in your study. And I mean, this can be a huge challenge if the RLD, in the worst case, is not marketed anymore, so you can procure it. It can be for orphan indication, so it can be really hard to get from the market, or it can be even like easily available, but the cost of a single product, of a single RLD, can be in the thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I mean, if you then think that like you need to have the statistical power, and like I will describe in a minute, the size of the study going up to 100 participants or more, you will see that like just the material cost for such a comparative use human factor study goes into the millions potentially. Similarly, since you need to cover a situation where the experienced user or user experienced with the RLD gets the generic product, the participants that you need to recruit for such a study will be participants who actually have experience with the RLD. again, if you have then this limited pool of users in the general population, it might be difficult to find these participants. And that can be even worse if those participants or the indications are orphan indications, or if you have the situation where, again, several generic companies try to develop a generic version of the same RLD, so trying to tap into the same user pool to recruit the participants for that study. And then again, since it is a statistically powered study, the sample size will be not like 15, 30, or 45 participants, but in many cases, depending on the number of user populations or the number of indications that you need to cover, you can have easily 100 or more participants. So all of that together, number of RLD samples you need to procure, number of participants you need to find, and the large size of the study are really like can have a huge impact and can be prohibitive. I mean, similarly, or in addition to that, the amount of industry experience with these types of studies is still very limited. So setting up the protocol will not be something that you can do in a couple of weeks or a month. I mean, like most companies will do this maybe the first or the second time, so it will take a long time to set this protocol up. And then it is really strongly recommended to align the protocol with FDA before initiating the study. So doing this preparatory work and then conducting the study, spending the time for recruitment, fieldwork, and so on, it can easily go 6 months, 12 months, or maybe even more before you have the results of such a study. And if you take this in the context of the development timelines for a generic product, 1 year is a long time. So this is why overall the impact of having these other design differences identified in the user interface can be really like almost prohibitive for a generic combination product to proceed with the development. Now, maybe coming from the challenges more to a solution-oriented part, so how we think or what we believe might be able to address these challenges and uncertainties. So it's really like the opportunities that we see is to allow or enable user interface differentiation while also ensuring patient safety. And one critical success factor is to have guidance or clarity on how to classify differences as being either minor or then non-minor or other. Because while the guidance gives some indications on how this should be done, I mean, that there might be differences in the user interface where the situation really is like black or white. It's clearly minor or clearly non-minor, but there is a large area in the middle where the situation is not black or not white, but it's gray. And there, this guidance is not clear enough to really make the exercise of classifying those user interface differences an easy feat. So to have a clear outline on the FDA expectations on what is considered as a minor difference, including ideally some examples or a structured framework that supports industry in assessing these user interface differences would go a long way in helping us along on this path, on this journey. I have been asked actually so when I was preparing the presentation, and that's why I put it now as one additional point here, is why do we need additional guidance? Why do we need examples? Why do we need a framework? I mean, we have the controlled correspondence pathway like Lisa Bercu just mentioned, or why is industry not simply doing what we need to do, develop the product, classify the differences, and then align with FDA through the controlled correspondence pathway, whether we have done that correctly or not. But if you put this from an industry perspective in the context of the overall development of a combination product, I mean, in the complete beginning, or we need to identify the product that we want to develop. We need to clearly identify what kind of constituent parts do we want to use. We need to find suppliers. We need to set up contracts with those suppliers. Those are all activities that happen long before we have a comparative analysis. And those are activities that have a huge impact on the requirements for the development and also the timelines that we have for the development of such a product. So at that stage in the beginning, we are not in a position yet that we can do a comparative analysis, because this comparative analysis, it's not like it's not an activity that stands on its own. And it's also not an input activity to anything else. It's really an output. So we need to start a design control process with defining inputs, outputs, and then only once we have like documents like a hazard identification with definition of or identification of severity of harm, once we have a use-related risk analysis in place, only then are we in a position to really perform or conduct this exercise of comparative analysis and then classifying differences as minor or non-minor, which we can then align with FDA on whether we have done this correctly or not. But that means at the time when this classification would have the most impact, when we would need to know what kind of differences can we implement or can we accept and still not having a risk or a huge risk of running into a comparative use human factor study. So at the beginning of the development, we are not in a position to do this exercise and align it with FDA. And that's why having clear guidance and examples that would facilitate an efficient project start would be immensely helpful. The next challenge or the next opportunities we see to enable this user interface differentiation while enabling patient safety is to have like a data-driven, risk-based approach for comparative use human factor studies. I mean, I think that there's clear indication, or also FDA acknowledges, or that there is limited experience or understanding with this comparative use human factor studies when you look at the GDUFA research program or the direction that the research goes into. I think it clearly shows that these comparative use human factor studies are challenging, and there should be a way how to address these challenges. So this is really for us from an industry perspective a huge problem, that the framework or the requirements for such human factors or comparative use human factor studies and the FDA expectations for a study design, and also the question, is there really like one size fits all of this study design? This is a big problem for us during our development. So just a couple of points here. First and foremost is really like how to define and also justify this allowable non-inferiority margin D is a big question and a huge challenge during the development. How to define the error rate of the RLD, which is required. I mean, in most cases that there might be some post-market data available that shows known use errors and so on, but use error rates of the RLD for different tasks, this is usually not published. So would the expectation be that a generic company performs as an input activity a human factor study with the RLD to establish like a baseline of the use error rates? I'm not sure if that is really the intention. Once you have done all of that, then how to perform your study analysis is a big question mark. I mean, the guidance talks about comparing use error rates, but what industry now receives as feedback from FDA is that we should not compare use error rates, but instead the overall use success. Which then is raising the question, is it possible to apply kind of like a tailored approach and have like D values, so non-inferiority margin values, depending on the task and also reflecting the criticality of consequences of use errors on that specific task? Or, I mean, if you need to compare the overall use success, it means you can apply only one D value. And I mean, this will then need to be the most stringent one. Is this then still reflective of the real world scenario and a risk-based approach or not? Defining the appropriate statistical powering and correct sample size. I mean, every generic company will have statisticians on hand for clinical trials and so on, but even those statisticians, they are in many cases not able to support the definition of statistical power or sample size for this type of comparative use human factor studies. So in many cases, also bigger generic companies might need to go external to find support in defining these parameters. And I mean, lastly, here also the challenge for recruitment of the participants, RLD availability and cost. Like I mentioned before, those are significant challenges for us. The opportunities that we see, how we can overcome these challenges and kind of like break down this wall, this prohibitive wall, is really, again, to have like clearer guidance on the FDA expectations for these type of study parameters and the possibility for a framework for a risk-based approach, if such an approach is really also supported by experience or data. So again, a few bullet points is really like guidance on defining the non-inferiority margin, ideally also being able to consider the consequences of the use errors, the severity of harm, and the potential learning effect. I mean, learning effect, I have it also at the bottom. There should, of course, be a difference between an emergency use device and a maintenance device. I mean, emergency use EpiPen, where a user might not get a second chance to make a use error. I mean, of course, that needs to be assessed differently, but we should have a possibility to also have a risk-based approach, like for a maintenance device, where a user potentially needs to inject once a day for months or years at no end. Or, I mean, if they have one use error in the beginning that has no clinical consequences, but that would inform their subsequent use of that generic combination product, there should be a possibility to reflect this also when setting up such a comparative use human factor study. The defined error rate parameters and guidance on endpoints, again, like the guidance talking about use error rates versus FDA feedback to industry, referring to overall use success. So having clarity on those aspects would be immensely helpful. And also having support on the expectations for statistical powering and guidance on the sample size calculation, potentially having like an online tool where industry can enter their required information, and that helps us then in defining or calculating a sample size that we know also fulfills FDA expectations would be really helpful. And really like summarizing this framework for a risk-based approach. This is really something that would be, and I think the GDUFA research initiatives also show that this is something that also FDA is thinking about. So this risk-based framework, like alternative study designs, alternative approaches maybe for statistical powering for lower risk differences, this would be really critical. I know Lisa Bercu already said that, like, I mean, interchangeability is out of scope here, and but I think it's still important just to mention that what we're talking here now, today and tomorrow, substitutability for generics, the application is even it's more widespread, because it's not only relevant for generics, because it's also relevant for biosimilars, because the concept of substitutability for generics and interchangeability for biosimilars, it's more or less the same. Or I mean, we have Orange Book, we have Purple Book, but the concept, user experience with the RLD, going to a pharmacy, getting a generic or a interchangeable biosimilar, and then no HCP intervention, no training potentially, that is the same that applies to both. And here, interestingly, I mean, there used to be an interchangeability draft guidance from FDA that was also describing the comparative use analysis, the comparative analysis and comparative use human factor studies. But when this guidance was finalized, all of that information was taken out. So right now there is this much information in the final interchangeability guidance on the development of a generic combination product, and there is no cross-reference at all to the under guidance. That means that, like, if we have an interchangeable biosimilar that we want to develop, we need to apply the under guidance. However, for biosimilars, we don't have the luxury of controlled correspondence. So if we want to submit a comparative analysis to the FDA for review, we can, of course, do this under the IND, but there are no timelines associated with that. And the experience shows that the review, it can take months. So it's really like a time-limiting step. And I mean, interestingly, also the PSUFA research roadmap that was published in January goes in the same direction as the GDUFA research roadmap. It's really, again, identifying user interface differences that will likely lead to differences in the use error rates. in the context of pharmacy-led substitution. And just yesterday, and I mean, I need to bring this in now because I didn't have time to put it on the slides anymore because it became only available yesterday. FDA has actually now proposed as part of this budget proposal for the fiscal year 2025 to get completely rid of the interchangeability designation on the 351 pathway. So this really reflects the current scientific understanding, and is really like a great step in the right direction. But for us now, it's raising the big question mark: what does this mean for the development of a combination product, a biosimilar, the user interface? Does this now mean that we need to follow the same requirements under the like a 505J submission for an ANDA, also for a biosimilar user interface or not? I mean, it just became available yesterday, so I'm hopeful that there will be like more guidance or information available that would clarify the situation. But right now, this is really one huge question mark that came up yesterday only. So overall, as a summary, opportunities that we see to address the challenges that we face for our generic combination product development, it's really like in 3 buckets. First would be to have clearer guidance, so updated regulation and guidance on the allowable device differences for as a substitutable generic combination product. So define interface differences that might even benefit users and or patients, and that can be considered as minor. Publish more or like as much as possible of the available data from the GDUFA research, so that we have also like a publicly available like repository of data that industry could refer to when establishing comparative analysis or setting up comparative use human factor studies. And for these comparative use human factor studies, try to resolve the uncertainties around these types of studies, and kind of like by doing that, changing them from being prohibitive to becoming supportive for the development of a really substitutable user interface. So again, like here, clarify the expectations on the study setup, and also establishing possibilities for alternative risk-based methods for assessing these user interface differences would be crucial. And moving forward, since yesterday, it seems even be more important, align the framework across different product types, because the situation, generic substitutability, interchangeable biosimilars, it's the same. So the synergies between the different products should be really like leveraged for future processes and guidances. And I mean, importantly, for biosimilars, establish really also a procedure for fast feedback on comparative analysis under the PSUFA. So overall, as a last slide, the goal should really be that we can ensure patient safety while at the same time fostering a combination product innovation that supports access and usability. And here, this balance between really the safe and effective use for the intended users on the one side, and the innovation, state-of-the-art combination product development on the other side. It's no easy feat. I mean, we are fully aware of that, but this is really the goal that we should all together work towards too. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Tim Briggs to the podium, please. Every click.
Moves it on. Okay.
I'll be here.
Morning, everybody. Hello to everybody online. Many thanks to Johannes for his presentation. Tough act to follow, but really interesting and insightful to know that we're aligned in our challenges. So my presentation is an industry perspective on challenges experienced using comparison to demonstrate substitutability. My name is Tim Briggs. I'm a Senior Principal Human Factors Engineer at Viatris. Disclaimer, so this presentation reflects my perspective on the topic and does not necessarily represent the views of Viatris. To give you an agenda, so we're going to take a look at a comparative assessment overview. some examples of comparative assessment challenges, and then dive into a case study. So looking at 3 challenges we experienced and finally conclude. So I've intentionally used the term comparative assessment here to just considering the broader assessment of both the comparative analysis and then also the use-related risk analysis. So we all understand the goal is to develop substitutable generic products with an interface that is familiar to those users who are experienced with the RLD. And this process is relatively straightforward when we're able to do that. So when we're able to develop a comparative interface and utilize the 3 threshold analysis to show that comparison, where the challenge arises is where we identify design differences through that process. So when we have a design difference, then we need to consider the impact, the potential impact to the user of the performance of that task, what risk controls exist, what potentially the user sees, understands, or does. We can bring in other sources of data, our perception, cognition, and action, our known problems analysis, anthropometric and strength data. And utilizing all that information, then we can use that to categorize our difference. Do we have a minor or another difference? As Johannes highlighted earlier, if we believe we have another difference, that assessment has really only just begun. So some examples of challenges that we've experienced and worked through. So the sequence of that assessment is very important. If we have a difference in a physical comparison, more than likely the user's interaction with the product is also going to be different. And we may need to introduce labeling differences to inform the user how to interact with the product. What do we consider a design difference? So can you have a difference, a visual difference in a product that doesn't get categorized as a design difference? Our goal is comparison, our goal is substitutable, but we also need to consider safe and effective use when we follow a standard design control process. So our goal our aim is to ensure that our risk controls are comparative to the reference product. However, when we also need to consider naive users who may not have had experience with the RLD, and are those risk controls that an RLD user may be familiar with, are they still state of the art? And is there any modifications there that would potentially introduce a difference? What supporting data can be used? We've touched on that previously. So we have our PCA. PCA is a very useful tool when we have a difference in design and we need to understand what the user sees, understands, and does. If we've already confirmed that the 2 designs are the same, potentially the PCA does not add a lot of additional value. When we get into comparative analysis and comparative use human factor studies, can we also consider the opportunity for learning? So when we have a product with a potential low risk on initial use, should we be considering more than just that first interaction with the product? And then finally, in situations where the RLD has been discontinued and there's no access to physical samples or device labeling, what user base should we compare against? Now I'm going to dive into a case study on that final point. So the case study that I'm going to talk about is naloxone. I'm sure you're all familiar with naloxone, but naloxone is a medicine that rapidly reverses the effects of an opioid overdose. It can quickly restore normal breathing to a person if their breathing has slowed or stopped because of opioid overdose. The RLD in this case is Narcan by Adapt Pharma. It was approved in April 1971 in 3 dosage forms. It is supplied in an ampule presentation, and it's listed in the FDA's Orange Book as discontinued for reasons not related to safety and efficacy. So the timeline of related products. So the RLD was approved in 1971. The IMS ANDA that was then approved in 1988 in a unique cartridge and syringe system. And then in 2020, Dr. Reddy's had an ANDA approved in a prefill syringe with co-packaged safety needle. Two additional dates of note are 2019, the FDA made a statement to increase the availability of all forms of naloxone. So clarifying that all three forms of naloxone should be made available for community use and are suitable for use for people with or without medical training. Final data note then is the Viatris ANDA was approved in 2020. So from a device selection point of view for the Viatris product, we selected a prefill syringe, glass syringe barrel, lower lock, plastic rigid tip cap, finger flange, and co-packaged safety needle. Reasons for that device selection was low cost to help increase patient access and improve usability over ampule and cartridge system. We're also able to utilize existing filling line capabilities. So challenge one, our intended user. So considering the FDA statement, our team debated for a period, do we need to consider a new intended user here? So considering substitutability, our intended user should align with the RLD. However, in this case, naloxone initially approved for use for trained clinical professionals for the reversal of opioid overdose in an emergency inpatient setting. So considering that those risk mitigations, original risk mitigations for the original product may have been appropriate for a HCP, now being used by laypersons, do we need to add additional instructions which may add differences when we complete our labeling comparison? Ultimately, we concluded that the Viatris product we would maintain alignment with the reference product to ensure substitutability, that if the reference product is deemed an acceptable option for community distribution, then so could the substitutable product. Second challenge was around our design validation strategy. So what product to compare against in situations like this where the RLD has been discontinued, there's no access to available samples, and the labeling is unavailable. What we did was, following FDA's guidance, referencing approved drug products in ANDA submissions. If the RLD labeling cannot be located, the applicant may compare against the labeling of another ANDA that references the same RLD and is currently marketed. So in order to support our conclusion of substitutability and ensure that we could complete a full comparative analysis, we selected, in addition to comparing against the RLD, we also selected to complete a full comparative analysis against the Dr. Reddy's ANDA, which is listed in the FDA's Orange Book as therapeutically equivalent to the RLD. Our final challenge then was around our indicative scale design. To give you some background as to why this posed a challenge, I need to give you an overview of the three products on the market. So the RLD supplied in an ampule. User withdraws from the ampule in a standard off-the-shelf syringe. The scale gives the user information on the residual volume. In comparison then, the reference standard, the IMS product, which if you're not familiar with, the plunger moves distal to proximal. So the scale in this case gives the user feedback on dose delivered. And then finally, the reference, also, so the syringe moving proximal to distal provides the user with an indication of dose delivered. So initially unclear as to what design to utilize to ensure substitutability, whether to provide dose, an indicative scale dose delivered or residual volume. Ultimately, we chose to align with the RLD, but utilizing similar graduations to the two on market products. So residual volume with dose increments of 0.5 ml. Residual volume, a known use search found no reports related to issues with graduation markings for the related products. ISO 14971 was applied and a risk benefit analysis conducted. In conclusion, developing a substitutable interface tends not to be a straight path. Expect to experience some bends in the road. Consider and compare what data is available for the RLD first. Utilize data for other approved generic can be used as supportive data, and consider your options for correspondence with the agency. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to invite Sarah Ibrahim to the stage, please.
Right, well, hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Ibrahim, the Associate Director of Stakeholder and Global Engagement in the Office of Generic Drugs. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first patient-led session in CRCG and hopefully the beginning of many more. So the healthcare system has recognized the benefits of a patient-centric approach in the overall improved disease control. It is critical that we engage with patients in decision-making process, empowering them to take better control for a better quality of life. Patients are at the heart of FDA's work, and we do believe that patients are the experts in their disease condition and that their voice should be integrated in all phases of medical product development. FDA patient engagements involves interactions between FDA as well as patients or patient advocacy groups to integrate patient perspectives into regulatory decision-making of medical products, including drugs as well as medical devices. These engagements ensure that patients' needs are considered for a better health outcome. The Office of Generic Drugs within the United States Food and Drug Administration aims to be more patient-centric by prioritizing access to safe, effective, and high-quality generic medications. While the term patient-centric is in general associated with innovative drug development, OGD's mission is inherently patient-centric. Now, integrating patient input in the generic drug development involves considering patient experiences with brand drugs, use of real-world data, and preferences at various stages. That includes pre-market evaluation to identify allowable differences in human factor studies, post-market surveillance involving communicating information to patients, encouraging safety reporting, as well as addressing drug shortages. OGD, in fact, supports research that is very patient, and disease-specific views and concerns are taken into consideration. And in fact, we welcomed and held our very first patient listening session in 2022. Now, industry can support patient considerations by identifying allowable product differences affecting perception as well as use errors, as well as addressing any safety issues proactively. It involves understanding patient preferences, clear communication, patient education, risk assessment, and a robust post-market surveillance. Integrating the patient voice enhances their trust as well as adherence. Now, patient advocacy involves identifying informational gaps as well as patient needs, ensuring informational relevance and inclusivity, and aligning with patient preferences and avoiding any costly development errors, and promoting positive patient behavior that fosters trust, compliance, as well as disease control. And with that, we'll go ahead and welcome our patient experts to the panel. Karthika? No problem.
Thomas is available. You can ask him to come on video.
Sure, perfect. Okay, so we have a minor technical difficulty with one of our patient experts, but we do have one on the line already. So we'll go ahead and ask our patient expert to kindly introduce themselves as soon as they come on the screen. All right. Welcome.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. And can you kindly introduce yourself to our?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out to be here and this listening session and taking in all the vast information that's being provided by so many researchers, doctors, and individuals. My name is Thomas Silver. I currently live in Pennsylvania. I'm also a co-founder of the Elijah Alavi Foundation. I'm a patient that suffers with multiple food allergies and asthma, and I'm here to give you my patient perspective on specifics of medication.
Thank you, Thomas. Amanda, can you kindly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Amanda Flowers. I currently live in Tennessee, and I suffer from chronic spontaneous urticaria as well as asthma.
Thank you so much. So to start off, I'd like to ask the two of you for all the questions to try to maintain the answer within a minute so that we can make the best use of our time and ask you as many questions as we can. And we first want to start with, what are the most important product or drug classes you use to manage your health condition? And we can go ahead and start with Thomas. He's on the line.
Okay, so the products that I use to manage my health conditions is I use a butyrol inhaler, and also in the event if I have an anaphylactic reaction, I use an auto-injector, specifically in the event of that. Also, I have urticaria on top of that as well. So these are the devices I have to manage my conditions on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Amanda?
For the urticaria, I have an antihistamine, and for the asthma, I have inhalers. I also carry an EpiPen.
Thank you so much. So what kinds of inhaler switching have you experienced? So for example, have you needed to switch your brand of inhaler because your inhaler was not on your insurance list of preferred drugs? And how did that switch affect you? And we'll start with Thomas again.
So I think one of the biggest factors with that is based on what kind of health insurance you have, which will determine what your doctor can prescribe or what the pharmacy can actually assist you with. So when you have insurance that is focused on employment, that insurance is a different type of health plan under considering like affordable health plan. I have affordable health care, so I'm only privy to the generic staples of the brand because that's what the insurance company can pay for. If it was a brand name, I would have to come out of pocket full price, which can be quite costly if I have that. So I can only go with whatever is affordable via my affordable health plan.
So how did that switch affect you?
In the financial aspects, it's feasible for me, you know, depending on what I'm making and so forth, is affordable. But in terms of the affectability of the medication, I can distinguish the difference between an actual brand and actual generic based on how it's used and how it's affecting me and my body. So with the Butyrol, based off of a brand name and that, there's a big difference for me. But I know with the auto injectors for anaphylaxis, I know the medication is synthetic, it's an adrenaline, which our body produces. That seems like to be effective, no matter whether it's a brand or generic. But the cost is one of the biggest factors.
Can you touch upon that minor difference that you sensed in the inhaler use?
I think, and this is just my theory in terms of whatever active or inactive ingredients they're using in these inhalers, I feel like I have to use more of my inhaler based on the generic version opposed to the brand name. So, and I've had that conversation with my primary care physician, is that I feel like I'm using my inhaler based off of the generic more often than the brand. And, you know, although the brand is, you know, quite costly, I have to stick with that. And then it looks like I'm not controlling my asthma well based off of the many uses of the inhaler of the generic version.
Thank you, Thomas. Amanda?
So I have had to switch. I actually went from a combination therapy and had to switch to an inhaler that required me to sub out 2 for the 1. So I actually have like a picture of that. So the one on the left was what I had been taking. And when I had to switch, I had to end up switching to 2 different ones.
And how did that affect you?
So it didn't work as well, but in addition to that, it's a major inconvenience. When you have to carry around a lot of things, it's hard to have room to put 2 inhalers to carry around everywhere, as well as 2 EpiPens.
Was the switch effect for the EpiPen also a challenge for you, or was that a smooth switch?
So the EpiPen, and here's a photo of that. When you use an EpiPen, you actually have to use it twice. So you would have to carry around 2. You're supposed to do 2 doses. So the generic is harder to use, but it's also a lot bulkier. And again, when you're carrying around 2 of those, it makes it a little bit challenging. The brand name in this case, which is AviQ, actually has, it actually counts for you. So when you're actually having an anaphylactic reaction, there can be panic that sets in. So if the device will actually count for you versus you trying to remember to counting correctly, trying to remember how long you have to leave it injected for, that can be a little bit difficult as well.
Thank you for that. Amanda, we'll start with you this time. Did your prescriber talk to you about that switch and what to expect or what you should be reporting after using your new product?
They did not.
They did not.
Well, let me say this. For the inhaler, yes. For the EpiPen, no.
Can I ask you who was it the healthcare professional? Was it your doctor, or was it at the pharmacy level? Where was the discussion?
The discussion for the inhalers was my provider, my pulmonologist.
Provider. Thomas, same question to you. Yes.
Can you repeat that question? Sorry about that.
Did your prescriber talk to you about the switch and what to expect or report?
My prescriber did not. It's mostly the specialist that would normally convey the message to me regarding that. My prescriber would just prescribe that based on, my physician. And then if I'm seeing a specialist based on my asthma or my allergies, those specialists will give me a more in-depth understanding of how to use the devices and medication.
So when you get a new type of inhaler, what do you do to make sure you know how to use it correctly?
I know for me with the inhalers, of course, shaking it, you need to get that viability out within the medication and shaking it and making sure you're doing the breathing prior to before inhaling the inhaler. So there's a way in terms of standing up and taking your inhaler, putting it in your mouth, and then breathing it in as you inhale it. So, and then there's the holding time with the inhalation and everything. But that's something that they teach you with the specialists and so forth, or there's other information online that can actually show you that as well. But again, it goes back to the effectiveness of the medication that I'm using. One brand name, I feel like I wasn't, even using in the event if I'm having an asthma exacerbation. Sometimes you're not thinking about doing all those steps. You're immediately using the device. And sometimes I feel the effectiveness immediately opposed to actually using a non-brand name specific asthma inhaler.
Thank you. Amanda, same question.
So I have a really good pulmonologist, fortunately, and they go over how to use the devices, but there's also good instructions inside of each box.
So have you ever received a generic inhaler at the pharmacy instead of the name brand inhaler you were prescribed or were using before? And the reason I mention that is that this is at a pharmacy level and you haven't had a chance to talk with your prescriber. Has that happened to you?
Yes.
Can you talk about the experience?
I can. So I was on ProAir, and when I went to pick up the prescription, they gave me just a generic albuterol. There was no discussion with the pharmacist as far as the change.
Thomas, do you have a similar experience?
Yeah, to point out, I was also prescribed Pro Air by my physician, but upon getting the medication, they did not have Pro Air, so they gave me the brand name. So I was to come out of pocket specifically for that. And being an asthmatic, I need the medication, so I'm coming out of pocket to pay for that additional cost where my insurance should have covered the Pro Air in the first case, you know. So I'm like, either wait for my prescriber to write a new prescription or get the medication right then.
So switching gears a little bit, do you carry an epinephrine auto-injector for yourself or a family member?
Is that reference to me?
Yes.
Yes, I actually carry 4 for myself. I keep 2 expire, and I actually keep 2 that are up to date in terms of the expiration. And plus, I also carry an additional 2 auto injectors for my son who has multiple food allergies. So in a sense, I'm carrying 6 on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. Amanda, same question?
Yes, I carry 2 because, again, I've been told that if you actually have to use the EpiPen, you need a second dose.
And was this specifically for the brand or generic or just in general?
For any of the EPIs.
Have you ever needed to use it?
I have not, fortunately.
Good. Thomas, same question to you.
I have used my EpiPen on myself based to exercise-induced anaphylaxis. I have used that multiple times, which kind of like changed my regimen and how I do work out. I've used my auto injector for spontaneous urticaria just for standing outside. I've had to use the auto injector on my son Sebastian for there was a contaminant at his school with peanuts. He had an allergic reaction using that auto injector as well. And I've also used it on my son, Elijah, who is no longer with us today due to an incident that happened in 2017. He had passed. I've used it prior to him passing away, him developing multiple food allergies and using the auto injector on him several times.
Thank you, Thomas. So do you have a trainer device? And if so, do you practice with it?
I do have a training device. I have multiple training devices from many different specifics of auto injectors from Teva to Mylan to AviQ to AdrenalClick. So I have all those training devices. And plus, I run a nonprofit that focuses on food allergies and asthma. So it's my responsibility to provide education and training, and for me to actually know how to use the device as well before I can train people on it.
Thank you for that. Amanda, same question.
I do have a trainer. I have, practiced with it, but I don't on a regular basis.
Okay. So who taught you how to use your epinephrine auto-injector?
The instructions.
The instructions, not your healthcare provider and not your pharmacy.
They did go over the AviQ, but not the regular EpiPen, which actually would need more explanation because the AviQ walks you through what to do.
Are the instructions on the label enough?
Yes.
Okay. Thomas?
When I was first given the epinephrine auto-injector, I was not told how to use it. It was something based off reading the instructions on the box. And then they have that saying blue to the sky, orange to the thigh, makes it simple, for people to remember the saying. But yeah, it was just the information on the box, especially when it comes to the auto injectors, especially the Mylan one or the Teva one. Those devices you have to do a certain way. There's no, like AviQ gives you a step-by-step how to.
So what epinephrine auto-injector do you have now, and have you had a prescription to other types in the past, and why the change?
It goes based off what your insurance provider can provide. I've had AdrenalClick, I've had Teva, I've had Mylan. Mylan I got when I was actually I had insurance through work, and I can pay but so much for that. But through affordable healthcare, I was only given whether it was AdrenalClick or Teva through those components.
Amanda?
I prefer the AviQ because it does count for you and tells you instructions. So if you are in a panic state, it walks you through exactly what to do. I can get the AviQ, but I would have to pay additional for that one. The generic, I don't have to pay for.
So I have a curious question, so we're going to go a little bit off script here. When you are giving that auto injector to your school, does that require you to retrain the teachers in school?
Is that reference? I take that as reference.
That's probably to you, Thomas. Yes.
Yeah. It's one of those things. Is like you have to constantly retrain people how to use these devices. Even with educators being trained for one time for them to last throughout the whole year. Many people still forget how to actually inject the auto injector. They're assuming it's just inject and remove, where there's timing with, you have myelin or whatever, you have to keep it in within 3 seconds. Same thing with AviQ. AviQ gives you a step-by-step, and it tells you exactly what to do and to remove the device. But a lot of it is more, just based off your understanding and repetitive training for you to just to grasp the understanding of it. So it's multiple times you have to keep training people.
So do you actually train with the trainer prior to using the EpiPen? And do you actually do that with whoever may be required to administer that in an emergency situation?
Yes, if they're legally able to assist in the event of emergency care, we train them with a trainer, and we can definitely show. I've done demonstrations with with the orange and also an expired auto injector, so they can see what the needle looks like, how the medication is being injected into the thigh. We have to teach them where to put the thigh and also where to put the medication in the thigh, and also steps to do with the person who suffered from the anaphylaxis and how to position them and so forth, just for the stabilization.
Amanda?
I haven't had to necessarily worry about somebody else administering it personally.
Okay.
So I haven't had to train anyone else.
What environments have you had to use an EpiPen for yourself or someone else?
I personally haven't had to use mine. I have to carry one because of doing allergy shots. You're required to. And I have had an allergic reaction to medication, but I ended up taking Benadryl instead of the EpiPen.
Thank you. Amanda? Thomas?
I've injected myself with my auto injector outside right after, like 20 minutes after a workout. I had to inject myself and call 911 because I was in an area where there was barely no one around that actually can be there to be with me. So it's like injecting myself and calling 911 for the service. I've given auto injectors in a play space with my son because of something they touched. They had an allergic reaction. And also in my home, I've actually had to administer auto injectors, multiple times. As Amanda said, is carrying 2 auto injectors in the event if there's a biphasic reaction, second reaction, you need that second auto injector, and sometimes a third if necessary.
Thank you. I'd like to actually open the questions for the audience if anyone has a question for our patient experts here.
Hey, first off, thank you guys so much for sharing your story. My question is more so towards you, sir. Regarding your son, do you think that the EpiPen is something that they can inject themselves? Have you been able to train and educate them on how to do it in case of emergency?
Can you repeat that question again? Sorry.
I can repeat it, probably easier. So the question is, do you believe that your son is able to self-administer the EpiPen, and have you been able to train your child? Is that correct?
Yeah, my son Sebastian, he's 11 now, but I've been training him since he was, able to speak and understand and comprehend certain things. My son also, Sebastian, he's on autistic spectrum. So based off of his ability, it's something that has to be repetitive with him in order for him to grasp onto the understanding and knowledge of it. But today he can actually administer epinephrine if he needs to, because he understands the signs and symptoms, what he can and cannot have, and where to put the EpiPen auto injector within the thigh. So he's familiar with that to grasp onto the understanding.
Thank you. We have another question. Yes.
Hi, thank you for sharing your stories. It's very much appreciated. If you could point out one thing that would alleviate the process and the use of this back and forth, or one over the other, what would it be for you? What is the biggest thing that you would change?
If that's directed to both of us, I would say affordability, making sure whether it's if the brand names can be affordable as well or can be accessible without cost, to those who can't afford it. I think that's one of the things. They could lower the drug prescription prices for, patients like ourselves, but it's still an out-of-pocket cost that many of us can't afford. And even with more middle-class people, it's hard to afford medication, whether it's a brand name or generic. So we have to look into those factors. I think that would be a better way to kind of like look at it, whether it's brand or generic, is the affordability for us.
Amanda?
I agree. The cost is the huge contributing factor. These medications are not identical if you have to switch to a generic. So again, for instance, the Aubi-Q, the pro to that is it's much smaller and more compact, but it also literally talks to you and walks you through what to do. And then as far as the inhalers, having to switch out the combination that has 3 therapies to 2 different inhalers is obviously a huge inconvenience.
Thank you for that. We have another question.
Can the panel talk about the instructions? Were there any problems with the written instruction inside the box?
If you haven't heard that, can you speak of the instructions and if there has been any difficulties in following those instructions?
The instructions are pretty clear and easy to follow.
Okay. Thomas?
I think with the instructions, when it comes to administering the auto-injectors, the EpiPens, the instructions are pretty easy to follow, except for adrenal click. Adrenal click I think you have to put more into using that in terms of removing the cover and doing everything else specific. I think there is a danger for harm within using that specific medication because the needle is mostly easily exposed from that one. So with that device, there should be a more in-depth understanding, because it's trying to train people that they're more afraid of using that than an actual myelin auto-injector because there's so much components involved. But with an inhaler, there are instructions on how to use it, but there's so many people that don't know how to really understand how to use an asthma inhaler or any type of inhaler. So many people just inhale and then keep it moving, and they do multiples where it's not being effective, and then they release particles of the medication, and you're not getting full, inhalation into your lungs for actually to work. So I think on the inhalers, there should be a clear, more in-depth understanding, because sometimes the instructions in those boxes, the lines are too thin and not a lot of people are reading it. So it either comes down to their healthcare provider or their specialist to actually really physically be there and guide them through how to use these medications.
Thank you so much. Any further questions from the audience? Oh, we have a question. Sure.
Could you expand on your use of Adrenaclick and those instructions?
Can you expand on your use of Adrenaclick and those instructions?
Yeah, so if you look at Teva and myelin, myelin has the same almost as Teva. It's like removing the blue cap and then grabbing it and injecting it into the thigh. With the Adrenaclick, it's weird because you're removing a very almost a cylinder type device, and you're removing that and you're doing something. If I wish I had it with me so I could physically show you it, but it's almost the movement of another particle within that and then trying to inject it. Sometimes the needle can be easily exposed. It's not retracted back in a sense as well, or a device to kind of like cover the needle. So it keeps that, and it can create harm in the event of whoever is using that and so forth. So it's always been something that I've always battled with. Even if I receive the device, I keep it because I don't want to wait for another prescription for another device. So it just creates some type of cumbersomeness for me just having that or training people with it.
Amanda, do you have any follow-up?
I don't, because I haven't used that specific one.
Thank you. Are we okay on time to continue with the questions? Any further questions from the audience? Yeah, one question.
Here is a question from the online. So from the patient and end user perspective, do you see any way to improve instruction for use, to highlight any differences between the RD and the generic product?
In terms of instruction use, it's like if you have the generic or the brand name and so forth, I think when it comes to the auto injectors, I think it's almost, they use a lot of pictures in their boxes and so forth to kind of explain how to use it. And again, we talk about there's, simple catchphrases, blue to the sky, orange to the thigh, makes it simple. But when it comes down to the inhalers, I think it should almost be as clear as that. Even on the box, it doesn't really say. And there are a lot of people who are, linguistically or depending on language barrier or educational settings, will not understand how to actually understand what the information is being conveyed, especially specific communities where there's, we talk about educational level, where are they at in terms of understanding that. That's why it has to go back. Yeah, the instruction should be clear and concise, but also your healthcare providers and specialists should also guide you into those steps of understanding how to use the medication.
Thank you, Thomas. Amanda, any follow-up?
Yeah, I definitely think that providers or prescribers should be going over the directions. Unfortunately, a lot of people probably don't read through it very well until they actually need it. And at the time of an event, you're not going to understand it as well. You're going to be panicked. You're going to miss things. The instructions are good, but I do think that you need to go over them ahead of time.
Thank you for that. Any further questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for sharing. So for the instructions, are they only in a written format, or is there a link where you could watch a video? And do you think a video would be helpful for instructing you on how to use the medication?
I mean, like I said, the products, when it comes to the auto injectors, they have a clear, graphic outlet on the boxes, simple catchphrases. There are multiple videos that you can watch to use inhaler, to use an auto injector, or any medical devices. There's also, they have those outlets for that. But again, it comes to the accessibility of how these people can get access to these things and understand it. Because you can look at using an auto injector, but there are so many people that still use an auto injector wrong. Even after looking at the instructions and the video, they will still inject wrong, inject it in the top thigh, which we know that can happen. You can, inject an artery there and cause even more detrimental damages. So even with that, but it's like when the event of emergency, you have to think quick. So some people don't think quick enough to understand, like, oh, what happened in that video or so forth. They're just going to act in the event of emergency. So there are many outlets out there to show you. But again, it comes to having the training multiple times to kind of like be almost innate in a sense within you.
Amanda?
Yeah, I would definitely agree that, especially in a panic state, that people are not going to remember as well. And hearing things and reading things, it sets in somewhat, but actually going through the motion yourself and having repetitively practiced would make the biggest difference.
Okay. Any further questions from the audience before we close the session? So our final note says, thank you so much for your generosity and sharing your expertise. We understand that complex products are quite difficult to develop, so take a patient perspective in your development process to guarantee its success. Thank you. Right back again.
That is the end of our speakers for today and discussion with the patients. We'd like to request both Thomas and Amanda to please stay on the line. If we have any further question from the attendees in person or from online, we'll take those questions. We'll now get started with the panel discussion session. I would like to invite all the speakers back to the stage, please. We will also have two additional panelists joining us. Markham Luke, who's the Director of Division of Therapeutic Performance 1, Office of Research and Standards, OGD FDA, is joining us today. We also have Commander Andrew Fine. He's a Senior Advisor with the Division of Clinical Review, Office of Safety and Clinical Evaluation, Office of Generic Drugs, FDA. We thank the panel for joining us here. So we can now open it up for any questions from the attendees.
This is a general question for the FDA. Ozempic in general, there is a strength which has been discontinued by Novo Nordisk, which is 2 mg in 1.5 ml. Now, a lot of our clients have pursued that strength. What would be the FDA's stand on whether they should continue that strength? And if so, what are they comparing against?
So you want to compare to reference listed product that's originally in the Orange Book. If it wasn't discontinued for safety reasons, then you can pursue and end up for that product.
But what are you going to compare that with? Because it's discontinued, that particular, it's not recalled for the safety reason, but that's been discontinued, and getting the samples of that strength is almost impossible.
So I think it's important for generic drug companies to predict at least which products you want in your development cycle and accumulate product beforehand so that you can have reference product for comparison. And there are ways to obtain products from distributors should they have any remaining stock, et cetera. But I think it's really important for generic companies to horizon scan and to think ahead and anticipate possible withdrawals from the marketplace.
I can just continue on. So for the user interface comparison, yes, the physical samples, the true physical comparison is not possible if it's a discontinued RLD strength. But what you can fill in those gaps with what we know about that discontinued strength, what the user interface is and was, and that can be formed from current labeling or prior labeling that describes how that product may have been used. But anything to fill in the gaps just to support what we know about the RLD, just because that is the basis of that comparison.
Can I add something?
Just one more thing to note, that would be a good opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, you could propose that approach and submit it in a controlled correspondence, and then the Office of Research and Standards could get back to you on that too.
Right, or a pre-ANDA meeting.
Thanks, Markham. Yeah.
Does any other panelists have anything to add? We can go to the next question.
I came with the background in design control and risk management in general for, devices and combination products. So if I ask FDA the most, fundamental principle to guide the balance in terms how much, you can be different from the branded. And because I asked that question really, when we go with the design control and risk management principle, we actually advocate to be reducing risk as far as possible, and then remain, state of art. That's how we define safety. So in this kind of particular situation, if you can summarize the most fundamental principle that industry can use to guide, where's the balance and what that would be? Put that in a very simple way.
So you're talking about design specifications, that's an engineering principle. And if you build into your design specifications, device similarity, and you're going to say, okay, well, we want the device to be as similar as possible and maybe only have minor differences in the context of your product versus the reference product. That'd be an ideal approach to your design specifications. But if that's not possible for some reason, say for the patent issues that were discussed earlier, or some other engineering concerns or manufacturability, then you need to figure out why that's the case and work around. This is why this is the job of an engineer, to figure out what those issues are and how to get around them in your design specifications. If your design specifications do lead to other differences, then you want to see what those other differences are and what the risks are for those other differences, and consider in your development plan whether you need to, whether it's possible to address those other differences with additional data. It doesn't necessarily have to be a comparative use human factors study. But a lot of it is innovative approach to engineering to get to as close to a design as possible.
And just to add, so the one fundamental principle is know the RLD. We need not just how it's used, what the user environment is, if it's who the end user, if it's a layperson. But I know as Tim pointed out, and earlier and Johannes pointed out, there is the need to innovate. But understand that RLD, really kind of understand what guardrails you have for that innovation. So I think Tim's example is spot on with the naloxone, is they broke down this RLD is an old product. So there's a need for innovate. There's a need for naloxone. But understanding how that RLD, which is the basis of that submission, how it's used, who the end user is, what else is on the market, they were able to identify those aspects where innovation could take place and really allow for that user interface to maintain that therapeutic equivalence back to the RLD. So it'll come up later today as well. But the RLD is really the starting point for what your guardrails are and how you can consider the innovation, how you can consider your design for the user interface, which would be then independent of any of the device performance and all that, which would be, obviously has to be part of that product development.
If I can just add some, the little challenge I deal with in this situation. In general, for risk management standard, we emphasize that state of art and also reduce risk as far as possible as the general principle. So then, and we know the healthcare environment, the user environment, all that is evolving. So some of the device or combination product done 10, 15 years ago, it could be, much better be designed. And I'm trying to find the balance, if you stay as what it was, well, then does that really reflect the true safety? Because that's in general, the safety is subjective. We actually balance on the benefit and also the other factors. So how that safety kind of being balanced in this kind of situation, or would you rather just stay as close as what it was? But then,
so in the generic space, you do want to try to stay as close as possible to avoid differences.
To avoid that. Okay.
But Will, do you want to address the issue of patents as well in the context of assessment of risk?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I mean, I think there's always the risk of getting too close and infringing the patents of the reference listed drug. But obviously, I think not having too much flexibility to deviate from that means that you can't sort of develop the product. And so I don't know. I thought Johannes had the really nice two brick walls next to each other that how closely linked it is. You're trying to avoid infringing patents on the one hand, and yet design something that's really close to the reference listed drug on the other hand.
But it's a business case too, right? Whether you want to go up against a patent.
Right. And I'm assuming when I was talking before that you're assuming it's a valid patent, but maybe it's not a valid patent. And so, right, it's then a question of whether you want to go down the process of filing paragraph 4 and getting sued and fighting it out.
maybe just what Markham said, or it's a business case, but this business case for a product development needs to be established at the beginning of the development. So that's why really like having this clarity would be immensely helpful to also like establish like a business case that is like most reflective of the reality. And I mean, having like non-minor or other differences or not has a huge impact on that business case. So that's why from an industry perspective, having this better clarity would establish and would allow us to establish a business case that's really as reflective as possible for the reality, and then allow us to make an informed decision. Do we want to move forward with that product or not? Or is it actually better to invest our effort in another product that has like a better chance of getting to the market?
I'd just add that, yeah, I completely understand where the question's coming from. And the example that I presented earlier was something we definitely wrestled with. Our risk management process is telling us that, yeah, potentially you need more risk controls there. But we had to consider the bigger picture. Our target was substitutability, therefore alignment was our end goal. None of us? Apologies. I just said I completely understand the question. In the example that I presented earlier, it was certainly something that we wrestled with. Our risk management process is suggesting that there is opportunity there for additional controls, and we have to consider what was our end goal, and that our end goal was substitutability here. So maintaining that alignment with the label.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for your presentations this morning. Some of the industry panelists raised the question about whether criticality and its impact on risk can factor into the decision about how to pick an acceptable NI margin and overall data analysis and reaching conclusions. So I'm wondering if the industry panelists can speak to how, if at all, you've done that or attempted to do that, and if the FDA panelists can respond with their considerations on the topic.
A very difficult question. I personally don't have insight that I could share. I don't know about you, Johannes, just put you on the spot.
Thanks for that. No, I mean, without going into too many details, I mean, it's like it needs to be a risk-based approach. Or so, I mean, you have risk analysis in place, you have hazard identifications in place. So those are documents then, or data that you need to really like leverage when designing such a comparative use human factor studies. How exactly you do that, I don't think that there is only like one right way. I think there are probably different options, and I'm sure like different generic companies are doing it in different ways. So I don't think that there is really like this one size fits all. But I mean, how to define the non-inferiority margin, it needs to be within your risk management documentation.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to say there's many sessions later today about specifically these questions. So I think even in the smaller group when the breakouts, I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn and share with each other, and hopefully pave some way for some progress.
Right, and the comparative use human factor study is the study of last resort for trying to look at the different risk assessments for other differences. So there are other pathways to comparing products for other differences. But for the non-inferiority margin, FDA is interested in doing some research and publishing what we find in that context, as you know. So thank you.
So question is to Dr. William. So this is related to the devices or the patent search you have done on, and also the subsequent clinical studies on several devices, particularly in inhaler devices. So my question is that whether your research is also found that the generic company which is developing the generic product equivalent to the reference and the reference listed drug, the originators, they are trying to prevent generic companies to get into the same domain by protecting the some design features. They continuously improving their device design features, trying to prevent the generic company. So what your research says, whether their aim is to prevent generic company or their aim is mostly related to come out with additional features to patient compliance, convenience, and any additional safety features. What your research says?
Yes, I think it's really hard to know the motivation because you're absolutely right. Some of these improve, they're good for patients. And what I struggle with a lot from a policy perspective is that these tiny innovations, adding a dose counter, isn't developing a breakthrough molecule that's going to change the lives of thousands and thousands of patients across the United States. A dose counter is an innovation, but how do we as a healthcare system reward that innovation in a way that's commensurate with its value, so that we're not rewarding it in the same way as the development of a brand new molecule that's a new therapeutic class and is going to cure disease. So anyways, roundabout way of getting your question. What's motivating the companies? I mean, you develop a dose counter, it's good for patients, but it's worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars with patent protection that buys you extra years of time. So I don't know what the motivation is, but all we can do is we look at how these patents get added after FDA approval, what it's doing to push out the period of patent protection. What we can observe is how much it's truly dissuading generic competitors from even filing the Paragraph 4 certifications in the first place, right? People here can speak to this better than me, but if you're a generic company looking at this big thicket of patents, maybe you're apprehensive about challenging that, going after that product, and you shift your attention elsewhere. So it's hard to know the motivation, but we see the same kind of behavior over and over: inhalers, insulin pens, GLP-1s, the same kind of tactics.
Hi, thanks for the presentations. I think this question is directed, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing, Dr. Keuschnigg.
No worries.
Okay. So in your presentation, there was a portion of the presentation where you were talking about sort of the development timeline and when sort of the comparative analyses come into play relative to, when perhaps that third-party device might be chosen, for example. And I'm trying to understand to what extent, I guess, from step one, at the part where a company is pursuing a particular prototype or evaluating what might be available on the market, I'm trying to understand to what extent already the available framework, and definitely heard you about, wanting more clarity and information around that framework, but to what extent is that applied earlier in the process? So at the point where you are thinking about, hey, I want to purchase this third party's device constituent potentially, or developing my own, if that's the case, is that coming into play? And is that somewhere that the industry is shifting towards in order to sort of mitigate the downstream effects that we're talking about?
Yes, so thanks for the question. And this is definitely something that comes into play. I mean, for an innovative product and the standard design control process, what it would be that you really you define your user needs, you define your design inputs, and only afterwards, then based on that input information, you start to really select your components and develop your product. But for generic combination products, it's not really usually the case, or because we have already the RLD, we know in which direction we want to go. So there is already a baseline and a framework where we need to work in, that we know, okay, we can't go completely outside of that framework and select components that are not falling within that framework posed by the RLD. I think the industry is moving more towards the acknowledging the impact that this input or these activities at the beginning have then further downstream. I think it used to be so that device, the design history file, design engineers, device regulatory were maybe not as much involved in the complete beginning when a product was chosen to be developed. And I think, at least the way I see it or how I experience it, we are moving more into the direction that we try to feed in the downstream consequences of our early choices really into this development, into the beginning of the development. So that we use the experts that we have in place that can speak to, okay, if we do it this way, it will have those consequences downstream, and therefore we should now choose like this component instead of that component. So yes, industry is moving more into that direction to kind of like try to apply the learnings from other projects and other products as early on as possible for any new development, so to avoid problems or difficulties then down the road.
Hi, I was going to send a question over to Amanda and Thomas if they're still on the line, because they've been kind enough to stick around for our panel. Are you guys still there?
I am still here.
Oh, great. Amanda, are you still with us? Oh, there she is. Great.
Yes.
So this is Katharine Feibus from FDA. I was listening carefully to the experiences you were sharing with us. And it seems that prescribers and pharmacists don't always make it clear to you as someone who's using a prescription or picking up a prescription for your family member, whether you're getting the same product you were prescribed before, or whether you're getting a similar product you were prescribed before that has the same active ingredient, but might not be exactly the same product. So for example, you have the EpiPen and you have Adrenaclick and you have the AviQ, and those are 3 completely separate epinephrine products that were developed and made by 3 companies and approved because they all work, but they're separate. It's like having, 3 different children. They live in the same family, but they're very different people. When you have a generic drug, there are laws and there are regulations about how they have to demonstrate that they're going to have the same effect and be as safe as that brand name drug that they're being substituted for. And at the pharmacy, the pharmacist can give you that generic. And sometimes, as you described, your insurance company is going to make you get the generic. And I was just wondering if in your experience, have either your pharmacists or your prescribers ever sort of pointed out the difference when they're making a decision that they're going to write you a prescription for it's a different medicine, it's a different product, but it has the same ingredients. It should do the same thing, versus saying, hey, there's some generics out there for this drug. And when you go to pick it up from the pharmacist, you may get one of those. And just in your experience, has any of your care providers ever helped you understand the difference or explain the difference? Or have you had to try to figure that out on your own?
I personally have not had that explained to me by pharmacist or doctor, the difference of the generic versus the brand.
Thomas?
Yeah, it's one thing I have not been. Pharmacists are not explaining it, neither is my primary care physician. They know they have to prescribe a medication, and the pharmacist was like, "Hey, do you have any questions?" Not a lot of people understand what they're actually doing. They're just going to use it to hopes to feel better, especially when it comes to you have an auto injector device. So I had to do research on my own. Being in the field that I'm in is understanding the difference between generic and also the brand name, and also what type of the active ingredients are inside these medications, especially with epinephrine. I understand epinephrine to the ability that I've learned based on it being synthetic and based off our body also having the same components, but to my understanding, they all work the same in terms of providing the same support and the line of access to emergency care to, help you in the event of emergency. But via primary care physicians or pharmacists, there's only a level and extent that they will go beyond, to try to reach out or help a patient.
Thank you, Thomas.
So I have a question regarding the requirement of comparing the success rate versus the user error rates. Can we get a little bit more insight into what agency is thinking as to why they're looking at success rate versus the error rate? And the second part is the success to be compared at each critical task level, or is it at an overall, end of the study kind of a comparison?
What's the second part first? Because I'm not trying to dodge any of the comparative use human factor studies questions, but I want to save those for the focus conversations later on those. But for the comparative analysis, each difference should be identified and then classified and assessed based on the framework and the comparative analysis guidance. So each difference should be either no difference, minor, or other design differences.
It's in regards to the comparative user human factor study, right? Like suppose there are 4 or 5 critical tasks. So it so happens that at one of the tasks, there is a difference in the success rate. But at the overall, the patient has been eventually been able to take the, successfully inject or administer. So would that be considered as an acceptable success rate?
If we can just hold that question to the CUH.
So thanks for the great panel. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to flex. Part of the reason is because DMEPA within the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology, they're the ones who review comparative human factor studies. So I'm looking at Irene and I'm looking at Jason in the audience. And so they'll probably be in the best position in later panels and discussions to answer those questions.
Right. We're going to have additional sessions on the comparative use human factors study. So for those questions, save that for a separate panel. On the issue of comparing one device to another, just to note that generic industry has not always been doing a very good job with that. When we get a request for comparative use through control correspondence, almost without fail, there's some issue that has not been addressed adequately. And a lot of those, fortunately, are minor differences, but it's really measuring the two devices and looking at the two devices and identifying what those differences are. It should not be that difficult a task, but we get some obvious differences that are not informed in your own report to us, and that's a concern. That does not inspire confidence. Thank you.
So just maybe one last question, and don't want to keep people from lunch break. So Chris Lamanna from Sando, fantastic discussion. And maybe this is food for thought for the upcoming sessions, because it does touch on the comparative use human factors study topic. But the topic of learning effect was brought up by both Johannes and Tim in their presentations. Be really curious to hear FDA's thoughts on what this might mean for how we set up studies or how we evaluate the data. So if there are errors which maybe happen once but never again because of that learning effect, how could that be considered in a comparative use human factors study? And then maybe one on the other side, kind of the negative learning transfer that you might have, where those types of user errors which happen with a reference product but wouldn't be transferred to a generic because the generic product is more simple or easy to use. Is that a consideration that might be built into your study or even the need for a study? So if you can clearly justify that those types of errors happening potentially with a reference product couldn't or wouldn't happen with a generic combination product, could maybe an alternative approach be pursued rather than a comparative use human factors study? And again, apologies, I know we're right before lunch, but maybe just food for thought.
Do one of the panelists want to address this, or do we want to keep this for one of our later sessions, the later detailed symposium discussions?
Keeping for later. Yeah. We're going to keep that in mind but thank you for that comment question. Thank you.
Are there online questions if you have?
Yeah, there is a couple of questions, but due to the time limit, I'm gonna ask one follow-up question about the discontinuation of the RAD. So if the strength is discontinued in the US market, but it is available overseas, then can the firm use the samples from which is marketed in the overseas for the comparative analysis?
First.
I'll take this one. So It has to be compared against the RLD. And once again, in those situations, if you can't access the RLD, you can come to us and propose an approach where you can provide information as supportive data, and we can look to see whether that would get us to where we need to go. But ultimately, the comparison would need to be against the RLD, which would always be approved in the United States. Anything else?
And we'll touch on this later this afternoon. We recognize that, a lot of these workshops talk about IP challenges, patents, all that, but RLD discontinuation, other RLD challenges do exist. So we'll touch upon that also this afternoon.
Do we have any other in-person attendee question?
Actually, I have a quick question. So I really appreciated how industry representative describe how important those regulatory guidances early on, how the design criteria is impacted early on. And perhaps nobody mentioned, but maybe you could speak to it for just a minute, how the decision whether it's commercially feasible to develop or to do not develop this product, how is that come into place? Because the downside for public health is there is no developer who wants to take a risk with that regulatory uncertainty. And this come up in interviews a lot, but perhaps you could articulate that if you can, with a couple of words.
I think if I understand the question, it's whether the potential that we might experience another difference is preventing us from developing a product.
Yeah, or uncertainty in regulatory guidance, uncertainty if you have to do the human factor study, repeat the human factor study, how it impacts the commercial feasibility of development of certain products. When do you stop discontinuing developing or don't attempt to develop? I'm sure those are big discussions within the industry.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting the reality at the moment. There's uncertainty that we can validate those sorts of products. And so, yeah, it is preventing developing.
But I think it's also difficult really to really put numbers to these kind of uncertainties. Or if you don't know, I mean, if there's like this huge gray area, are you running into non-minor differences or other differences? If yes, how large does the study then need to be that you need to perform? I mean, those are really like details that are really difficult to put into numbers at the beginning of a development. So I mean, if the business case is clearly positive, then maybe like a non-minor differences would not be the reason to not start the development. But if it's already like borderline, whether this really like will pay off in the long run or not, then these kind of questions really become more and more critical. But it's challenging, like I said, to really like put like numbers. Okay, this is like 1 million, this is 10 million, it's 1 year, it's 6 months, what these consequences are. So they can only be put into a business case like on a high level at the moment. Maybe once there is like more industry experience with these consequences, the impact it has, it will be more easy to put really like numbers to these challenges and uncertainties, and then have like a more concrete business case to be established.
This is a comment about the marketplace for medical products. So medical products currently have an international marketplace, and a decision to go, no go for development of products, at least from my experience interaction in the device space, they often take into consideration, is this feasible to market in Europe? And without, even if there are patents in the US, can we utilize the European pathway? And I think the same thing might apply in the context for drug device combination products as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is one point. I mean, usually we try to develop one product that's like applicable worldwide. I mean, we don't do really like tailored developments. Maybe like the US is an exception, or because of this big market, it might be so that like we develop a product really like specifically with the US scope, but that is usually not the intention. I mean, if this is a product that is helping patients, then we want to bring it to those patients really wherever we can. So we try to have like a global development, which also can pose a challenge if there are differences between the US RLD and the EU RLD that needs to be factored into one development. So, yeah.
And I would just add to echo Markham's point, we do see for some of the highest profile inhalers, robust generic competition in Europe, even when they're duking it out over patents in the US. So absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Because I did think I heard the talk about approaching global access. So there is a constant communication between FDA and EMA, and one of the initiatives that we've launched roughly 2 years ago was the parallel scientific advice. So it is a combination of what we would consider a pre-ANDA or the scientific advice meeting that you would have with EMA in the intent that you have a product development pursuing both markets. So early on, we're allowing industry and actually encouraging industry to communicate with both EMA and FDA through the parallel scientific advice to seek a concurrent advice with both agencies for that global access. So we do understand that complex products are difficult to develop, and incentivizing it with access to multiple markets really does help our global access.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists who have joined us today. And thank you for the attendees. I think we'll break for lunch now. That wraps up Symposium 1 for the day. Thank you.